tonight we walk together along an ancient path, one worn smooth by millions of footsteps over 25 centuries. This is the path the Buddha himself traveled, not to some distant paradise, but into the very heart of this present moment. These stories we'll share aren't meant to teach you something new. They're here to help you remember what you've always known, but perhaps forgotten. In the noise of daily life, the Buddha's wisdom doesn't ask you to become someone different. It simply invites you to see clearly who you already are beneath all the worry and striving. Welcome to Buddha Bedtime Stories. This is your refuge, a quiet harbour where you can let down your guard and rest in the safety of timeless truth. Before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. What brings you here tonight? Is it peace you're seeking? Relief from restlessness? Or perhaps just a gentle companion for your journey into sleep? Share in the comments what these stories offer you. The teachings you'll encounter tonight have been lights in the darkness for countless souls who felt lost, anxious, or alone. They aren't complicated. They're as simple as noticing your breath, as profound as accepting this moment exactly as it is. There's nothing you need to do right now. No effort required. Just allow these ancient words to find their way into the quiet spaces within you, like water seeping into thirsty ground. Now, let's prepare ourselves to truly listen. Adjust your body until you find a position of real comfort. Perhaps your head needs another pillow, or your shoulders want to release toward the earth. Take your time. This is important. You deserve to be completely at ease. When you're settled, take a slow, deep breath. Feel the air fill your lungs, then gently release. One more time, breathing in peace, breathing out whatever you no longer need. Let us begin our journey together with the first story. In a mountain monastery, there was a pond that perfectly reflected the sky above it. At night, when the moon was full, there would appear to be two moons, one in the sky and one in the water. A young monk named Daiki was troubled by this. Which is the real moon? He would ask. The one in the sky or the one in the water? The other monks would laugh. Obviously, the one in the sky is real. The one in the water is just a reflection. But Daiki wasn't satisfied with this answer. He would sit by the pond for hours, watching both moons. The moon in the water was just as bright, just as beautiful, just as present to his vision as the moon in the sky. In what sense was it less real? He asked his teacher, Master Hakuin, "If I can see the moon in the water, if it affects me just as much as the moon in the sky, how is it not real?" Hakuin smiled. "Touch the moon in the sky." "I can't. It's too far away." "Touch the moon in the water!" Daiki reached toward the pond, but as his hand approached the water, the moon's reflection rippled and fragmented. "I can't touch that one either." "Then in what way is one more real than the other?" Hakuin asked. "Both exist in your experience. Both affect you. Both are impossible to grasp. What makes you think reality and reflection are different things?" This question opened something in Daiki's understanding. He had been taught to distinguish between real and reflected, original and copy, substance and shadow. But his experience didn't support these neat distinctions. When he looked at the moon in the water, he really saw it. The experience of seeing it was real, even if what he was seeing was a reflection. When he felt moved by its beauty, the emotion was real, regardless of whether he was looking at the original or the reflection. His life, his experience, his feelings, all of these were happening in response to both moons equally. He began to wonder about other reflections in his life. When he thought about his deceased mother, was he experiencing his actual mother, or just a memory, a reflection of who she had been? Yet his love for her was real. His grief was real. The way she had shaped him was real. Did it matter that he could only access a reflection of her, not her actual presence? When he read teachings from ancient masters, was he experiencing their actual wisdom or just reflections of it, filtered through translation and time and his own interpretation? Yet the teachings affected him, changed him, helped him. The reflections had real power. When he practiced meditation and caught glimpses of what the teachings called his true nature, was he experiencing the actual thing or just reflections of it in his limited consciousness? Yet whatever he was experiencing, it was transforming his life. One evening, Daiki sat by the pond with Master Hakuin, watching the two moons. "Master," Daiki said, "I think I've been making a mistake. I've been trying to distinguish between the real and the reflected, but everything I experience is in some sense a reflection. I never touch reality directly. I only experience reflections of it in my consciousness, interpretations of it through my senses, and understanding. If I dismiss all reflections as unreal, I dismiss my entire life." Hakuin nodded. "This is a good understanding. The question isn't whether something is real or reflected. The question is whether you're aware that you're looking at a reflection, or whether you mistake the reflection for the only reality." He pointed at the moon in the water. "The danger isn't in seeing this moon. The danger is in thinking this is the only moon, in believing that your reflection of reality is reality itself. But if you know you're seeing a reflection, if you remain aware that there's something beyond what you can directly experience, then the reflection serves its purpose. It points you toward what it reflects." Over the following months, Daiki deepened this understanding. He learned to appreciate reflections without mistaking them for the whole truth. He could love his memory of his mother while knowing it was a reflection of her, not her actual presence. He could value teachings while knowing they were fingers pointing at truth, not truth itself. He could work with his experiences in meditation while knowing they were reflections of his true nature, not the full reality of it. He found this understanding incredibly freeing. He no longer needed to grasp the ungraspable or fully understand the incomprehensible. He could work with reflections, learn from them, be transformed by them, without needing them to be more than what they were. One day, a new student came to the monastery and asked Daiki the same question he had once asked. "Which moon is real? The one in the sky, or the one in the water?" Daiki smiled, remembering his own confusion. "Both are real," he replied. "One is the original, one is the reflection. But your experience of both is real. The light from the sky moon and the light from the water moon both enter your eyes. Both create responses in your consciousness. Both affect you. The only difference is that you can't directly touch either one, and one will remain even if you disturb the water." He looked at the two moons thoughtfully. Most of what we call our life is reflection. Reflection of the past in memory. reflection of reality in consciousness, reflection of truth in words and concepts. We live in a world of reflections. This isn't a problem unless we forget that they're reflections. Then we start fighting about whose reflection is most accurate, claiming our interpretation is the only real one, trying to grasp what can't be grasped. The new student asked, "So, how should we relate to reflections?" "Appreciate them," Daiki replied. "Learn from them. Be transformed by them, but hold them lightly. Know that they point to something beyond themselves. The moon in the water shows you where to look for the moon in the sky. Your experiences point you toward the truth beyond experience. Your understanding reflects reality, but isn't identical to reality. This awareness keeps you humble and keeps you seeking." Years later, when Daiki became a teacher, he would often bring students to the pond on full moon nights. He would have them look at both moons and ask, "Which is real?" Some students would confidently say the sky moon was real and the water moon was just a reflection. Daiki would ask them, "Then why can you see them both equally well? Why does the water moon move you just as much as the sky moon?" Other students, trying to be clever, would say both were real. Daiki would ask them, "Then why does one remain when you throw a stone in the water and the other doesn't?" A few students would grow quiet, realizing the question itself was based on assumptions that didn't hold up under examination. These were the students Daiki knew were ready for deeper teaching. The question "which is real" assumes reality and reflection are opposites, he would tell these students. But actually, reflection is a form of reality. It's a real reflection, a real experience, a real perception. The problem isn't with reflection itself. The problem is when we mistake partial reflection for complete reality, when we think our limited experience encompasses the whole truth, when we cling to our interpretations as if they were the things themselves. He would point at the two moons. Your life is like looking at these moons. You're always experiencing reflections, never the thing itself. You reflect reality through your senses, your consciousness, your understanding. This reflection is a real experience. It shapes you, teaches you, transforms you. But it's not the whole story. Stay aware of this. Appreciate your reflections. Learn from them. But don't mistake them for the unreflected reality. One student asked, "Will we ever experience unreflected reality? Will we ever see beyond reflection?" Daiki was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Perhaps in death, perhaps in enlightenment, perhaps never. I don't know, but I know this. The effort to see beyond reflection is itself valuable. The awareness that we're experiencing reflection keeps us humble, keeps us seeking, keeps us from absolutizing our limited perspectives. And sometimes in rare moments of clarity, the reflection becomes so perfect, so transparent, that the distinction between reflected and unreflected almost disappears. Those moments of clarity are themselves gifts of the reflective nature of consciousness. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider that your entire experience right now is a reflection. These words are reflections of ideas. Your understanding of them is a reflection of the words. Your sense of yourself is a reflection of something deeper. Your thoughts are reflections of the underlying mental activity you don't directly experience. Everything you know comes to you as a reflection. This doesn't make your experience less real. It makes it what it is, a real experience of reflected reality. You're seeing the moon in the water, and that seeing is genuine, even if what you're seeing is a reflection. Let this understanding help you hold everything a bit more lightly tonight. Your worries are reflections of possible futures. Your regrets are reflections of the past. Your sense of who you are is a reflection of something deeper and more mysterious than you can fully know. All of these reflections are real experiences, but they are not the whole truth. Rest in the understanding that you live in a world of reflections, and that's actually okay. You don't need to grasp the ungraspable or fully understand the mystery. You can appreciate the moon in the water without needing to hold the moon in the sky. You can live with reflections, learn from them, be moved by them, without mistaking them for everything that is. Both moons are beautiful. Both are real in their own way. And you, experiencing both, are having a real experience of something that transcends both. Rest in that paradox tonight. Rest in reflection. Rest in the mystery of experiencing what you can never fully grasp. It's enough. It's always been enough. The reflection of peace is peaceful. The reflection of rest is restful. You don't need the original when the reflection serves you so well. Sleep now, watching both moons, knowing both are real and neither is everything. That's the truth. That's enough. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a tale about recognition and the true nature of worth. This is the next story. There was a farmer named Hideaki who worked his land diligently, waking before dawn and laboring until dusk. His son, Daichi, seemed to be his opposite, lazy, sleeping late, avoiding hard work whenever possible. Hideaki was ashamed of his son and frustrated by what he saw as wasted potential. "That boy will never amount to anything," Hideaki would complain to his neighbors. "I work myself to exhaustion while he lounges under trees and daydreams. He has no ambition, no drive, no sense of responsibility." The neighbors agreed with Hideaki's assessment. They saw Daichi as a disappointment, a young man who would never succeed because he lacked his father's work ethic. Some pitied Hideaki for having such a lazy son. Others judged Daichi harshly, predicting he would become a burden on his family and community. What no one knew, including Hideaki, was that Daichi spent his time under those trees observing. While appearing to do nothing, he was watching everything. How water moved across the land, which areas stayed moist, and which dried quickly, where wind patterns created microclimates, and how different plants thrived in different locations. Daichi was learning the land in ways his father, focused only on immediate work, never had. While Hideaki fought against the land's natural tendencies, trying to impose his will through hard labor, Daichi was learning to understand the land's own wisdom. One year, a severe drought struck the region. Hideaki worked harder than ever, carrying water to his crops, trying to save them through sheer effort. But most of his crops died anyway, as did the crops of other hard-working farmers. The drought was too severe for labor alone to overcome. But Daichi, who everyone thought was lazy, quietly directed his efforts to the areas of the farm he knew, from his observations, retained moisture longest. He planted drought-resistant varieties in the driest areas. He used the natural wind patterns he had observed to create shade and reduce evaporation. He worked with the land's characteristics rather than against them. By the end of the season, Daiichi's sections of the farm had produced a modest but real harvest, while Hideaki's sections had produced almost nothing despite his exhausting efforts. Hideaki was stunned. "How did you do this? You barely worked compared to me." "I worked differently," Daiichi explained. "While you were laboring, I was learning. While you were fighting against the land, I was understanding it. My apparent laziness was actually observation. I was working, just not in ways that looked like work to you." He showed his father the subtle features of the land he had noticed, the slight depression that collected morning dew, the rock formation that created afternoon shade, the soil composition that retained moisture better than surrounding areas. "I learned all this by watching," Daiichi said, "by sitting still and paying attention rather than constantly moving and doing." Hideaki felt something shift in his understanding. He had been so focused on visible labor, on constant activity, on the appearance of hard work that he had never stopped to actually understand what he was working with. His son, whom he had judged as lazy, had been doing a different kind of work, the work of observation, understanding, and learning. "I'm sorry," Hideaki said. "I judged you without understanding what you were doing. I thought activity was the same as productivity, that visible effort was the same as effective effort. You were working all along, just in ways I didn't recognize as work." Word spread through the village about Daiichi's success during the drought. People who had judged him as lazy began to see him differently. Some felt ashamed of their premature conclusions. Others were curious about his methods. Daiichi began teaching other farmers what he had learned. He showed them how to read the land, how to observe rather than just labor, how to work with natural patterns rather than against them. The farmers who had once thought him lazy began to value his seemingly idle observation time. "I used to think you were wasting your life under those trees," one neighbor admitted. "Now I understand you were studying. You were learning in ways that look like laziness to people who don't understand what learning can be." A Zen monk who heard this story visited Daiichi. "You've learned an important lesson that many people never learn," the monk said. "You've learned that judging too quickly, based on appearances and conventional standards, often misses the truth. Your father judged you by how much visible labor you performed, but the quality of your outcomes proved that visible labor isn't the only measure of value." Daiichi nodded. "I learned something else too. I learned that what looks like laziness might be rest, or observation, or a different kind of work, and that what looks like hard work might be an inefficient struggle. Appearances are misleading, outcomes reveal truth." The monk smiled. "Your story reminds people not to judge too harshly or too quickly. The lazy son might be a careful observer. The apparently wasted time might be valuable learning. The story that seems simple at first viewing often has complexity that only reveals itself later." Years passed, and Daiichi became known as a wise farmer, though he still spent time sitting under trees, watching the land. His father, who had once been ashamed of him, now proudly told people, "My son taught me that there are many kinds of work, and the work that looks least like work is sometimes the most valuable." Hideaki learned to balance his own labor with periods of observation. He became a better farmer by incorporating some of his son's apparent laziness, taking time to watch and understand rather than constantly acting. One day, a young person came to Daiichi asking for advice. "My parents think I'm lazy because I spend time reading and thinking instead of working constantly. They say I'll never succeed. What should I do?" Daiichi smiled. "Keep reading and thinking, but also find ways to apply what you learn. Let your outcomes speak for you, not your appearance in the industry. My father thought I was lazy until he saw what I produced. Your parents will understand when they see the fruits of your different kinds of work." He paused, then added, "But also understand their perspective. To someone who values visible labor, observation looks like idleness. To someone who measures worth by constant activity, stillness looks like laziness. Don't judge them for judging you. Just prove through outcomes that your way has value too." The young person asked, "But what if I fail? What if my approach doesn't produce results?" "Then you learn and adjust," Daiichi replied. "I wasn't just sitting under trees doing nothing. I was observing, learning, thinking, and planning. If my approach had failed, I would have learned from that and tried something else." The point isn't that observation is always better than labor. The point is that judging approaches too quickly before seeing their outcomes often misses value. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider who you've been judging as lazy or unproductive. What if their stillness is observation? What if their rest is preparation? What if their apparent inactivity is actually a different kind of work that you don't recognize? And what about yourself? How harshly have you judged your own times of rest or stillness? Have you internalized the belief that only visible activity counts as work? Have you dismissed the value of observation, learning, thinking, and resting because these don't look like traditional labor? Not all work looks like work. Not all productivity is visible. Not all success comes from constant striving. Sometimes the lazy son who watches patiently sees what the hard-working father who never stops moving misses. Sometimes stillness achieves what activity cannot. Sometimes the full story only reveals itself long after the first judgment is made. Rest now without judging your rest. Let yourself be Daiichi under the tree, observing, learning, preparing in ways that might not look productive to outside observers, but that create real value. The lazy son wasn't lazy. He was doing a different kind of work. And so are you, even in this moment of apparent inactivity. Rest is work. Observation is productivity. Stillness is motion that hasn't revealed itself yet. Trust that the full story of your life will prove this, even if current appearances suggest otherwise. Sleep now, not lazy, but learning. Not inactive, but preparing. Not wasting time, but using it in ways that will only reveal their value when the drought comes, and your careful observation produces a harvest where frantic labor produced nothing. In a monastery, there was a meditation hall with a heavy wooden door that was always kept closed during practice sessions. The door had no lock, but everyone treated it as if it were locked, entering only at designated times and never leaving during meditation periods. A visiting monk named Gensho noticed this and asked why no one ever left during meditation, even though the door was clearly unlocked. "It wouldn't be proper," one monk explained. "During practice time, we stay in practice. Leaving would break the container, would disturb others, would show a lack of discipline. But you could leave if you wanted to, Gensho asked. Technically, yes, but we don't. Gensho found this fascinating. These monks were living as if imprisoned during meditation sessions, but the prison existed only in their minds. The door was open. They could leave any time, yet they sat as if bound. He began to notice similar patterns throughout the monastery. People living within invisible constraints, following rules that had no enforcement mechanism, restricting themselves to prisons that had no walls. One day, during a particularly long meditation session, Gensho stood up, walked to the door, opened it, stepped outside into the sunlight, and then walked back in and sat down. The other monks were shocked by this violation of protocol. Afterward, the abbot called Gensho to his chambers. "Why did you leave during meditation?" "To see if I could," Gensho replied, "to test whether the constraint was real or imagined." It was imagined. The door was never locked. I was never actually trapped. I was sitting there by choice, not by compulsion. "But we all know we could leave," the abbot said. "The point is that we choose not to." "Do you really know that?" Gensho asked. "Or have you assumed for so long that you shouldn't leave that you've forgotten you have a choice? There's a difference between staying by conscious choice and staying by habit or assumed constraint. One is freedom. The other is just a comfortable prison." This question disturbed many monks. They began to realize they had been treating many choices as if they were requirements. They had been living within restrictions that no one was actually enforcing. They had imprisoned themselves with beliefs about what they should or shouldn't do. The abbot considered Gensho's point carefully. "You're right," he admitted. "We've been treating the open door as if it were locked. We've been prisoners of our own assumptions. But what do we do with this awareness?" "First, acknowledge it," Gensho said. "See clearly that most of your constraints are chosen, not imposed. Then decide consciously. Which constraints serve you? Which do you want to keep? And which are you maintaining out of habit or fear, not because they actually help you?" He gestured toward the meditation hall. "That door has always been open, but if you never test that, if you never actually check whether you could leave, then you're living as if imprisoned, even though you're free. True freedom begins with recognizing which prisons are real and which are imagined." Over the following weeks, the atmosphere in the monastery changed. Monks began questioning which rules actually served their practice and which they followed out of mere habit. They discovered they had internalized many restrictions that had no actual external enforcement. One monk realized he had been afraid to speak his honest opinions for years, not because speaking was forbidden, but because he had decided early on that it was safer to stay quiet. No one had actually silenced him. He had silenced himself. Another monk discovered he had been avoiding certain foods, not because of any monastic rule, but because he had once been told they were inappropriate for monks, and he had never questioned this. The restriction existed only in his belief. A third monk realized he had been limiting his meditation practice to certain times and places, not because practice was restricted to those times, but because he had created a mental rule about when and where meditation counted. "We've been living in prisons of our own making," one monk said during a group discussion. "The doors were open all along. We just never tried to walk through them." Gensho nodded. "Most people live this way. They believe they're trapped in circumstances, jobs, relationships, and patterns of behavior. They believe they have no choice. But often, if they examined closely, they'd discover the constraints are their own beliefs, not external reality. The door was never locked. The abbot asked, "But doesn't this lead to chaos? If everyone starts leaving meditation sessions whenever they want, ignoring the schedule, doing what they please, doesn't the structure fall apart?" Possibly, Gensho agreed. But structure maintained through unconscious compliance isn't real structure. It's just a habit pretending to be discipline. True structure comes from conscious choice. When people choose to stay, not because they believe they must, but because they genuinely want to, that's authentic practice. When they stay simply because they never questioned whether they could leave, that's just imprisonment with no walls. He looked around at the gathered monks. "I'm not suggesting you abandon all structure or discipline. I'm suggesting you own your choices. Recognize that you're staying because you choose to, not because you have to. Recognize that the door is open and you're free to leave, and then decide whether to stay or go based on authentic choice rather than assumed constraint." This teaching spread beyond the monastery. People in the nearby town heard about the open door and began examining their own lives. How many constraints were they living under that existed only in their minds? How many prisons had they created for themselves? A woman realized she had been staying in an unhappy marriage not because of any real obstacle to leaving, but because of stories she told herself about what leaving would mean. When she examined these stories, she found they were beliefs, not facts. The door had always been open. A man discovered he had been working at a job he hated for years, believing he had no choice, that his family responsibilities required it. When he looked honestly, he found there were other options he had never seriously considered because he had assumed from the beginning that he was trapped. An elderly person recognized that many of the limitations they experienced weren't from age or circumstance, but from beliefs about what old people could or couldn't do. The constraints were largely self-imposed. The teaching of the open door, people began to say, is that most prisons are mental. We're free more often than we realize. The question isn't whether we can leave, but whether we've been living as if we can't. Years later, the monastery still practiced meditation with a closed door during sessions. But now there was a different quality to it. Everyone knew the door was unlocked. Everyone knew they could leave any time they chose. They stayed not from obligation or assumed constraint, but from authentic choice. The practice deepened because people were choosing it freely, rather than submitting to it from habit or fear. Gensho's simple act of walking out and back in had freed an entire community from invisible prisons, not by tearing down structure, but by revealing that structure maintained by genuine choice is stronger than structure maintained by unconscious compliance. Tonight, as you rest, you might examine the doors in your own life. Which ones do you believe are locked? Which constraints do you accept as unchangeable? What prisons are you living in that exist only in your beliefs? The door has always been open. You've always been freer than you realized. The constraints that feel so solid are often just habits of thought, beliefs you've never questioned, stories you've told yourself for so long that you mistake them for truth. You're not as trapped as you think. You have more choices than you've acknowledged. The prison is mostly mental, and mental prisons can be walked out of the moment you realize the door was never actually locked. This doesn't mean every choice is easy or without consequences, but it means you're choosing even when you believe you have no choice. And recognizing that you're choosing is the beginning of real freedom. Rest now in the understanding that you're freer than you knew. The door is open. It's always been open. You can stay or go based on authentic choice, not on assumed necessity. This recognition doesn't require you to change anything external. It just requires you to see clearly. The constraints you live under are more permeable than you thought. You've had more freedom all along. You just haven't been exercising it. Sleep now as a free person, aware that tomorrow you can walk through any open door you choose, or stay where you are by genuine choice rather than imagined imprisonment. The freedom was always yours. Now you know it. As we move deeper into the quiet teachings of Zen, we come to a story about seeing clearly and understanding true value. Listen carefully to the next story. In a mountain village famous for its textiles, there was a master weaver named Chio who created cloth of extraordinary beauty. Her patterns were intricate, her colors perfectly balanced, her technique flawless. People would travel for days to commission work from her loom, and her pieces hung in the homes of nobles throughout the province. Then, one winter morning, Chio woke to find her hands had stiffened with arthritis. The pain was intense, but worse was the loss of the fine motor control that her craft demanded. She could no longer work the shuttle with her usual precision. The delicate adjustments that created her signature patterns were now impossible. For a weaver, this seemed like a death sentence. Chio's entire identity, her life's work, her purpose, all depended on her hands. Now those hands betrayed her, refusing to do what she commanded. She sat before her loom for hours, weeping, unable to imagine a future without her craft. Days turned to weeks. The loom sat silent. Chio refused visitors, refused commissions, refused to even look at the beautiful threads that had once brought her such joy. Her apprentice, a young woman named Nao, came regularly, begging Chio to teach her, to at least pass on knowledge if she could no longer create. But Chio sent her away each time. "What's the point?" she would say. "Without my hands, I have nothing to teach. I am nothing." One day, Nao arrived with a request that Chio couldn't refuse. A small child from the village was sick, and his mother had asked if Chio might weave even a simple cloth for the child's comfort. "She doesn't expect your fine work," Nao said gently. "She just wants something made by you, even if it's rough. She believes your cloth has healing in it." Chio couldn't say no to a sick child, so she returned to her loom for the first time in months. Her stiff hands struggled with the shuttle. The tension was uneven. The pattern she attempted came out distorted. Everything her hands produced now was clumsy, imperfect, wrong. But she continued, driven by compassion for the child. She created a simple blanket, nothing like her former masterpieces. The weave was loose, the pattern irregular, the whole piece marked by the limitations of her arthritic hands. She wrapped it with shame, certain the mother would be disappointed. When Nao delivered the blanket, the mother held it and began to cry. "It's perfect," she said. "Tell Chio it's the most beautiful thing she's ever made." Nao brought this message back to Chio, who couldn't believe it. How could that rough, imperfect work be beautiful? It's everything I spent my life learning not to create." The mother said she could feel the struggle in it, Now reported. She said she could feel your hands fighting to create something despite the pain. She said it reminded her that beautiful things can emerge from difficulty, that limitation doesn't mean the end of creation. Her child is struggling too, and she said this cloth would remind him that struggle can still produce beauty. This response shook something loose in Chio's understanding. She had thought beauty required perfection, that her arthritic hands could only produce inferior work. But this mother had seen a different kind of beauty, the beauty of creation despite limitation, of persistence through difficulty, of love expressed through imperfect means. Chio returned to her loom with a new perspective. She stopped trying to create what her hands could no longer produce and started exploring what they could produce. The patterns that emerged were unlike anything she had made before. They were asymmetrical, organic, and marked by the randomness of her unpredictable hand movements. They told stories of struggle and adaptation, of beauty that included rather than denied imperfection. People noticed something profound in this new work. Her earlier pieces had been technically superior, but these new pieces touched something deeper. They were relatable in a way perfection never is. They spoke of being human, of limitations, of finding beauty not despite obstacles, but through them. "Your old work was impressive," one patron told her. "This new work is moving. I look at your perfect pieces and admire them. I look at these new pieces and feel understood." Chio began teaching again, but with a transformed philosophy. "I spent 30 years pursuing perfection," she would tell students. "I thought my value as a weaver came from my technical mastery. But arthritis stripped that away and showed me something more important. That beauty doesn't require perfection. That limitation can reveal new possibilities. That the work of imperfect hands can touch hearts in ways that perfect technique never could." She would show students her early work alongside her later work. "These first pieces show what skilled hands can do. These later pieces show what love can do with whatever hands you have. Which is more valuable?" The answer isn't obvious. Now, who had continued as her apprentice through all these changes, asked one day, "Do you wish you could have your old hands back? Do you miss being able to create perfectly?" Chio thought for a long time before answering. "I miss the ease of it," she said honestly. "I miss not feeling pain with every movement, but I don't miss who I was when perfection came easily." That Chio was skilled but narrow. She understood only one kind of beauty. This Chio, with her stiff, painful hands, understands more. The arthritis took my technical perfection, but it gave me depth I never had before. She held up her gnarled hands. "These hands taught me what my young, nimble hands never could, that obstacles refine what truly matters. When I could create anything, I created what was impressive. Now that I can only create with difficulty, I create what's true." The limitation stripped away everything superficial and left only what's essential. Years passed, and Chio's hands grew worse. Eventually, she could barely work the loom at all. But by then, her teaching had become as valued as her weaving once was. She taught people to see obstacles not as endings, but as refinements, not as barriers, but as editors that remove what's unnecessary and reveal what's essential. "Every limitation is a teacher," she would say. It shows you what really matters by taking away what doesn't. My hands took away my technical mastery and revealed that mastery was never the point. The point was always connection, expression, and the creation of beauty that touches hearts. I can do that with arthritic hands. I just had to learn a different language of beauty. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own limitations, your own obstacles, your own arthritic hands. What has been taken from you that felt essential? What can you no longer do that once defined you? These losses aren't just subtractions. They're refinements, removing what's superficial to reveal what's essential. Your obstacles are teaching you something. They're stripping away the easy answers, the impressive exteriors, the technical perfections that never touched anyone's heart anyway. What remains, what you can still do despite your limitations, that's what truly matters. That's where your real beauty lives. Rest now in acceptance of your arthritic hands, your imperfect instruments, your limited capacities. They're not preventing beauty. They're refining it, teaching it, revealing it in forms you never would have discovered through ease and perfection. The weaver's silent loom eventually spoke with more power than her perfect one ever did. Your limitations will teach you the same truth if you let them. In a city famous for its artists, there was a renowned sculptor named Kaori who had created magnificent works for temples, palaces, and public squares throughout the land. She was known for her perfectionism, her unwillingness to declare any work complete until every detail was exactly right. At age 60, Kaori received a commission that she knew would be her masterpiece, a memorial sculpture for the city's founder. She had complete artistic freedom and unlimited time. This would be her legacy, the work by which all her other work would be judged. She began with intense focus, creating preliminary sketches, building models, and selecting the perfect stone. The first year was spent in planning. The second year is spent roughing out the basic form. By the third year, the sculpture was recognizably taking shape as a figure of dignity and strength, capturing something essential about leadership and vision. But as the sculpture neared completion, something strange happened. Kaori couldn't finish it. Every time she thought she was done, she would see another adjustment to make, another detail to refine, another element that wasn't quite right. The nose could be more precise, the hands could be more expressive, the drapery could flow more naturally. Years passed. The sculpture stood in her studio, nearly complete, but never quite complete enough. City officials would visit, would ask when they might see the finished work, and Kaori would assure them it was almost ready, just a few more refinements needed. 10 years after beginning the project, Kaori was still working on the same sculpture. It had gone through countless iterations. Areas she had refined years earlier, she would redo, claiming her skills had improved, and she could do better now. The sculpture had become an obsession, a project that consumed her life but never reached completion. A young sculptor named Isamu, who admired Kaori's earlier work, came to apprentice with her. He expected to learn from watching a master complete her masterpiece. Instead, he found an old woman trapped in endless refinement, unable to stop working on a sculpture that had been nearly done for years. "Why don't you declare it finished?" Isamu finally asked, after watching Kaori rework the same hand for the third time since he arrived. because it's not perfect yet, Kaori replied. I can see the ideal form in my mind. This stone version still falls short. I need to keep working until the stone matches the vision. But will it ever match? Isamu asked gently. Will the real sculpture ever match the perfect one in your imagination? Kaori had no answer. She had never asked herself this question. She had always assumed that with enough work, enough refinement, enough time, she could make the physical sculpture match her mental ideal. A Zen teacher named Etsuko, who had known Kaori for decades, visited the studio. She looked at the nearly complete sculpture with a sad expression. You're destroying it, Etsuko said. I'm perfecting it, Kaori protested. No, you're overworking it. The sculpture lost its life years ago when you couldn't stop refining it. Now it's becoming tight, over-controlled, anxious. I can see your perfectionism in every surface. The early spontaneity is gone, replaced by compulsive detail. She touched the sculpture gently. Completion doesn't mean achieving perfection. It means recognizing when continuing diminishes rather than improves. This sculpture was probably finished 5 years ago, but you couldn't see it because you were comparing it to an impossible ideal rather than accepting it as the real thing it actually was. Kaori wanted to argue, but she knew Etsuko was right. She looked at her sculpture with honest eyes for the first time in years. It was beautiful in parts, overworked in others. The areas she had refined most recently were actually worse than earlier versions. Too controlled, too fussy, too perfect. The sculpture had lost its breath somewhere along the way. How do I know when something is done? Kaori asked quietly. How do I distinguish between stopping because it's complete and stopping because I've given up? You feel it, Etsuko replied. True completion has a quality of rightness, even if the work isn't perfect. Giving up has a quality of defeat. But what you're doing now is neither completion nor giving up. It's compulsive continuation, working past the point where work helps. That's different from both completion and abandonment. She looked at Kaori directly. The sculpture should have been installed in the city square years ago, where people would appreciate it. Instead, it's trapped in your studio, being endlessly refined toward an ideal it will never reach. You're preventing it from serving its purpose because you can't accept that it's good enough. That's not dedication to excellence. That's fear disguised as perfectionism. This truth landed hard. Kaori realized she had been afraid to finish the sculpture, afraid to have it judged, afraid it wouldn't live up to her reputation. As long as it remained unfinished in her studio, it remained perfect in potential. Once completed and installed, it would be real, subject to criticism, limited by its actual qualities rather than protected by its imagined ones. I've been hiding, Kaori admitted, calling it refinement when actually it was avoidance. With Etsuko's help, Kaori looked at the sculpture one more time and made a decision. She declared it complete as it was, not perfect, but real. She stopped working on it and arranged for its installation. When the sculpture was finally revealed in the city square, public response was mixed. Some people loved it. Others thought it was good, but not as exceptional as they'd expected from a decade of work. Critics noted both its strengths and its weaknesses. It was not a perfect masterpiece. It was a good sculpture with both beautiful passages and overworked areas, a real work rather than an ideal one. And Kaori found unexpected peace in this. The sculpture was done, installed, serving its purpose. It wasn't perfect, but it was complete. It had moved from endless potential to limited actuality, and this movement was itself a kind of perfection. Not the perfection of flawless execution, but the perfection of genuine completion. I spent 10 years trying to make it perfect, Kaori told Isamu, standing together, looking at the installed sculpture. I should have spent 3 years making it good, and then accepted that good was enough. The extra 7 years didn't make it better, they just delayed it. Isamu asked, "But how will you know with your next work? How will you know when to stop?" "I'll try to recognize when I'm working from love versus working from fear," Kaori said. "When I'm working from love, I'm responding to the actual piece, helping it become itself. When I'm working from fear, I'm trying to make it match an impossible ideal, trying to protect myself from criticism or judgment. The work from fear doesn't improve the piece. It just makes it tighter, more controlled, more dead." She touched a rough area of the sculpture that she had always intended to smooth further. "See this? For years I planned to refine it, but now I see it gives texture, life, contrast. My perfectionism wanted to eliminate it, but actually it's one of the better parts. Sometimes what we think is incomplete is actually just real, and real includes roughness, includes elements that don't match the ideal." In her remaining years, Kaori created several more sculptures, and each one she completed more quickly than the last. She learned to recognize the moment when a work was done, not perfect, but complete. She learned that completion meant allowing the work to be what it actually was, rather than endlessly pushing it toward what it might ideally be. "My final work taught me that sometimes completion means stopping, not finishing," she told students. "Sometimes good enough is actually excellent, because continuing would diminish rather than improve. Sometimes the work is done when you can let it go, not when it's perfect." Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what in your life needs completion rather than more refinement. What projects, relationships, phases, identities have you been endlessly working on, unable to declare them finished because they don't match your ideal? What would it mean to accept them as complete, as good enough, as done? Completion doesn't require perfection. It requires recognition that continuing is no longer serving the work or serving you. It requires courage to let the real thing exist, rather than protecting the imagined perfect thing by keeping it perpetually incomplete. Rest now in completion. Let yourself be done with some things, not because they're perfect, but because they're finished. Let yourself stop refining and start living with what actually is, rather than what might ideally be. The sculptor's final work teaches that holding on too long destroys as surely as letting go too early. Learn to recognize the difference, and then, when it's time, let go. With each step on the Zen path, a new lesson unfolds. Now we turn to a story about recognition, of self, of others, and of what truly matters. Listen carefully to the next story. In a valley between two mountain ranges, there was a river that confused everyone who saw it. Most rivers in the region flowed from high elevations to low, following gravity as rivers should. But this river appeared to run uphill, flowing from what looked like lower ground to higher ground, defying logic and nature. Villagers argued about the river for generations. Some said it was cursed, that supernatural forces made it run backwards. Others insisted it was an optical illusion, that the river only appeared to run uphill but actually didn't. A few claimed the river was evidence of magic in the world, proof that natural laws could be suspended. A scholar named Fumiko came to study the peculiar river. She was a woman who trusted observation over superstition, who believed that understanding came from careful study rather than easy assumptions. She spent weeks walking the river's length, taking measurements, making careful notes. What she discovered was unexpected. The river wasn't running uphill at all, though it certainly appeared to be. The optical illusion was created by the unusual topology of the valley. The way surrounding hills created a visual context that made lower ground appear higher and higher ground appear lower. When you adjusted for this visual distortion and looked at actual elevations, the river was flowing downhill as it should, following gravity perfectly. But there was a second discovery, more interesting than the first. There was a short section where the river actually did flow uphill, pushed by an underground spring with such force that it created a brief reversal of normal flow before gravity took over again. This wasn't magic or curse, it was hydrology, underground pressure overcoming gravity temporarily, a natural phenomenon that looked miraculous only because people didn't understand the forces involved. Fumiko shared her findings with the villagers, explaining the optical illusion and the underground spring. Some villagers were relieved to have the mystery explained. Others were disappointed. They had preferred the magical explanation to the scientific one. But an old farmer named Gonji said something that made Fumiko reconsider what she thought she'd discovered. "The river teaches something important," Gonji said. "It teaches that things can look completely wrong while being completely right, that what appears to violate natural laws might just be responding to forces we don't understand yet." He pointed to his fields. "I plant crops that other farmers say won't grow in this soil. They say I'm working against nature, that I should plant what everyone plants. But I've learned that this soil has properties they don't understand, that what looks like wrong farming is actually right farming for these specific conditions." Fumiko thought about this. She had explained the river's apparent backwards flow, but Gonji was suggesting something deeper, that the river taught people to question their assumptions about what's natural, what's possible, what's right. The river looked wrong, but was responding perfectly to actual conditions, both the optical conditions that made flow appear backwards, and the geological conditions that briefly pushed water uphill. "You're saying the river teaches us to look deeper before judging?" Fumiko asked. "More than that," Gonji replied. "It teaches us that backwards and forwards depend on what forces you're aware of. To someone who only knows gravity, water flowing uphill is impossible, wrong, against nature. But to someone who understands underground pressure, water flowing uphill is perfectly natural, a correct response to present forces." He gestured to the river. "How many things in life look wrong because we're only seeing some of the forces involved? How many people are judged for going against the flow when they're actually responding to forces others can't see?" Over the following months, Fumiko expanded her study. She began collecting stories of things that appeared to violate natural expectations, but actually didn't. They just responded to forces that weren't immediately obvious. A tree growing bent at a strange angle because of prevailing winds that had since died down. A flower blooming in winter because of an underground hot spring. A bird flying inland before storms because it sensed pressure changes humans couldn't detect. Each example taught the same lesson. What appears wrong might be responding perfectly to reality, while what appears right might be ignorant of important forces. A young mother came to Fumiko with a problem. My son won't follow the path I've set for him. He's going backwards from where he should go, against everything natural and right. How do I make him flow the right direction? Tell me about your son, Fumiko said. The mother described a boy who refused to take over the family business, who wanted instead to become a traveling musician. It's backwards, she insisted. Children should continue family work. That's the natural flow. He's going against nature. Or he's responding to forces you're not seeing, Fumiko suggested gently. Is he talented musically? Very, but that's not the point. Talent doesn't change duty. Doesn't it? Fumiko asked. The river appears to flow backwards because of forces beneath the surface. Perhaps your son is flowing in a direction that looks backwards to you, but is actually responding to forces inside him, talents, passions, purposes that you can't see or don't value. Just because his flow doesn't match your expectations doesn't mean it's wrong. She told the mother about the river, about how it appeared to defy nature, but actually followed it perfectly when all forces were considered. Your son might be like that river. What looks like backwards rebellion might be forward movement towards something he's meant to do. The question isn't whether he's flowing the way you expected, but whether he's flowing true to himself. This conversation troubled the mother, but she began to observe her son differently. She noticed how music seemed to flow from him naturally, how he came alive when playing, how his path, though different from hers, had its own rightness to it. Eventually, though it was difficult, she accepted that his backwards path might be his right path. Word spread about Fumiko's teachings about the backwards river. People began using it as a way to reconsider their own judgments. When someone's path looked wrong, they would ask, "Am I seeing all the forces involved? Or am I judging based on incomplete understanding?" A magistrate applied this thinking to a legal case. A man had broken a law, but when the magistrate investigated deeper, he found forces that explained the law-breaking in a way that changed the judgment entirely. The man wasn't defying order. He was responding to a greater order that the law itself hadn't anticipated. A teacher applied it to a student who learned differently from others. Instead of judging the student as backwards or wrong, the teacher looked for the forces, the different cognitive patterns, the unique intelligences that made the student's apparently backwards approach actually forward for him. Years later, Fumiko's study of the backwards river had become famous beyond the valley. She was invited to give lectures, to advise rulers, to teach scholars. But she always returned to the river itself, watching its apparently impossible flow, using it to remind herself that understanding requires humility, that what appears wrong might be right in ways she hasn't yet grasped. A visiting philosopher asked her, But aren't some things actually wrong? Doesn't your river teaching lead to excusing everything, to saying nothing is really backwards because we just don't understand the forces? No, Fumiko replied carefully. Some things are genuinely wrong. They're responding to destructive forces like cruelty or ignorance or selfishness. The river teaches discernment, not relativism. It teaches us to look for forces we might not see before judging, but after looking, we still make judgments. The difference is, our judgments are informed by deeper understanding rather than surface appearance. She pointed to the river. This river looks backwards, but isn't. But if a farmer tried to make his irrigation flow uphill without underground spring pressure, that would be genuinely backwards, genuinely wrong. The teaching isn't that everything is right. The teaching is that apparent wrongness requires investigation before judgment. Some backwards flows are responding to forces we need to understand. Others are just backwards. Tonight, as you rest, you might reconsider things in your life that appear backwards or wrong. Your own path that doesn't match expectations. Other people's choices that confuse you. Circumstances that seem to violate how things should be. Before judging these as wrong, ask, what forces might I not be seeing? What underground pressures might be pushing flow in directions that look impossible, but are actually perfectly natural? The backwards river teaches humility in judgment, curiosity before conclusion, openness to forces you don't yet understand. Not everything that looks wrong is right, but some things that look wrong are responding to reality more accurately than things that look right. The only way to know is to look deeper, to consider forces beyond the obvious, to remain humble about the limits of your understanding. Rest now in acceptance of apparent backwards flows in yourself and others. Let the river run its course, responding to all the forces acting on it, both visible and hidden. Trust that what looks impossible might be possible, that what seems backwards might be forward, that nature is wiser than our quick judgments about what's natural. The river knows where it's going, even when it appears to go the wrong way. In a coastal city, there lived a renowned mapmaker named Genji, who had charted more territory than any cartographer of his generation. His maps were detailed, accurate, and highly sought after by merchants, explorers, and military leaders. Every island, every coastline, every mountain range he documented was rendered with precision. But Genji had a practice that other mapmakers mocked. Whenever his knowledge ended, whenever he reached the limits of what had been explored and documented, he would leave the map blank. Large white spaces appeared on his charts, marked only with the words "unknown territory," or sometimes just left empty. Other mapmakers found this approach unprofessional. They would fill in the blank spaces with speculation, with reports from unreliable sources, with educated guesses. A map should be complete, they would argue. Blank spaces make it look unfinished. Blank spaces are honest, Genji would reply. They tell the truth, that we don't know what's there. Filling them with guesses tells a lie, that we do know. But the criticism stung, especially when clients would choose other mapmakers' complete maps over Genji's honest but incomplete ones. People wanted certainty, even false certainty. They wanted maps that told them what lay everywhere, even if those maps were partly fiction. One season, a wealthy merchant named Ichiro commissioned Genji to create a map for a trading expedition to distant islands. When Genji delivered the map, Ichiro was dismayed by the large blank areas. "What am I supposed to do with this?" Ichiro complained. "I need to know what's in these blank spaces. I need to plan my route." "What's in those spaces is unknown," Genji replied. "No reliable expedition has charted them. I can't tell you what I don't know." "But other map makers have filled in these areas," Ichiro protested. "They show islands, harbors, channels." "Based on speculation," Genji said. "Based on second-hand rumors and wishful thinking. If you sail using those maps, you'll be navigating by fantasy. My blank spaces at least tell you where certainty ends." Ichiro hired a different map maker who provided a complete map with no blank spaces. The expedition set sail using this fully detailed chart, confident in their route. 3 months later, the expedition returned, having lost 2 ships. They had found islands where the map showed open ocean, encountered reefs where the map showed safe passage, and wasted weeks exploring channels that didn't exist. The complete map had been worse than useless. It had been dangerous. Ichiro returned to Genji, chastened. "Your blank spaces would have saved lives. If I had known we were entering unknown territory, I would have proceeded cautiously. Instead, I trusted a map that pretended to know, and that false certainty led to disaster." "Blank spaces scare people," Genji acknowledged. "They remind us how much we don't know, how limited our understanding is. But pretending we know more than we do is worse than admitting our ignorance. The blank space says, 'Be careful here. Proceed thoughtfully. Don't assume.' The falsely filled space says, 'It's safe to trust this,' which is a dangerous lie." Word spread about Ichiro's disaster and Genji's honest maps. More clients began to value the blank spaces, recognizing them as marks of integrity rather than incompleteness. They learned to read Genji's maps differently. The detailed areas showed where knowledge was reliable. The blank areas showed where caution was needed. A young apprentice named Lin came to study with Genji. She had been trained by other map makers who filled in all spaces, and she struggled with Genji's insistence on leaving blanks. "But we can make educated guesses," Lin argued. "We know the general geography of the region. We can estimate where islands are likely to be." "And we'd be wrong half the time," Genji replied. "An educated guess isn't knowledge. It's speculation with a fancy name. If you mark speculation as if it's fact, you're lying to whoever uses your map." He spread out several maps on his table, his own with its blank spaces, and competitors' maps of the same regions with every space filled. These complete maps look more professional, more finished. But which is more honest? Which better serves someone trusting their life to the information? Lin began to understand, but still she resisted. People don't want to be told we don't know. They want answers, even imperfect ones. Then they want comforting lies rather than uncomfortable truths, Genji said. And it's not our job to provide comforting lies. Our job is to chart what's known and clearly mark what's not. The blank space is information. It tells you something important. Here be dragons, or at least here be unknowns. Proceed carefully. Over time, Lin learned to value the blank spaces. She discovered that leaving areas blank required as much skill as filling them in. You had to know exactly where certainty ended, had to resist the temptation to extend your knowledge beyond its actual limits, and had to be comfortable with admitting you didn't have all the answers. One day, an explorer returned from a region Genji had left blank on his maps. The explorer had detailed charts of what was actually there. "Your blank space wasn't really blank," the explorer said, showing Genji islands and coastlines that had been unknown before. "Now it's not blank," Genji agreed, carefully adding the new information to his map. "But it was blank until you explored it. That's how honest maps work. They grow as knowledge grows, but they never pretend to knowledge we don't have." He looked at the transformed map. "See how the blank space has been replaced with detail? That's how it should happen. First honest acknowledgement of ignorance, then actual exploration, then knowledge replacing the unknown. But some map makers skip the first step and go straight to filling in spaces with imagination, which prevents anyone from recognizing what actually needs to be explored." Years later, Genji's blank spaces became the very thing that made his maps valuable. Explorers would deliberately seek out the blank spaces on Genji's maps, knowing these marked genuinely unexplored territory rather than cartographic guesswork. Military leaders trusted Genji's maps precisely because they showed where trust should end. A historian interviewing Genji late in his life asked, "Don't the blank spaces bother you? Don't you wish you could fill in all the unknown areas before you die?" "No," Genji replied without hesitation. "The blank spaces are the most honest things on my maps. They say, 'I don't know,' which is often the truest thing a person can say. I could fill them with speculation and fantasy, making maps that look complete. But I'd rather make true maps." He gestured to his life's work, hundreds of maps, all marked with careful detail where knowledge existed and honest blankness where it didn't. "These blank spaces are my legacy. They're me admitting the limits of my knowledge, refusing to pretend omniscience, valuing truth over completeness. Every mapmaker who fills in the unknown with guesses is choosing ego over integrity. I choose integrity." The historian looked at a particularly large blank space on one map. "Will this ever be filled in?" "Perhaps," Genji said. "Perhaps someone will explore that region and bring back reliable information, or perhaps it will remain blank forever. Either way, my map is honest right now, which is all any map can be." The map maker who fills in that space with speculation is making a map that's dishonest right now, in the hope that by accident he might be correct later. That's not map making. That's gambling. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider the blank spaces in your own understanding. Where are you filling in unknowns with speculation, pretending certainty you don't have, telling yourself and others you know things you actually don't? What would it mean to leave those spaces blank, to honestly mark them as unknown? The blank space isn't a failure. It's honesty. It's saying, "I don't know," instead of offering false certainty. It's admitting the limits of your understanding rather than pretending those limits don't exist. This feels vulnerable because we're taught that certainty is strength and uncertainty is weakness. But actually, false certainty is weakness disguised as strength, while honest uncertainty is strength willing to show itself. Rest now in your blank spaces. Let yourself not know what you don't know. Let yourself mark large areas of your life, your future. your understanding as unknown territory. This isn't an admission of failure, it's commitment to truth. The mapmaker with blank spaces serves better than the one with false completeness. So do you. Your honest "I don't know" is more valuable than anyone's false "I'm certain." Sleep in the blank spaces tonight where truth lives. As our exploration of Zen Buddhism deepens, let us listen to a story that reveals how true worth is often overlooked. Here starts the next story. There was a devoted student named Akiko who studied with a Zen master for many years. She took meticulous notes on every teaching, every conversation, every insight that arose during her practice. Her room was filled with journals and scrolls, a massive accumulation of written wisdom that she treasured as proof of her learning. She would often review her notes, rereading old insights, checking her understanding against what she had written. The notes gave her a sense of security, a feeling that she was capturing and keeping the teachings, making sure nothing was lost. One day, her master, a woman named Mumon, came to Akiko's room and looked at the mountains of notes with a frown. "What is all this?" "My notes," Akiko said proudly. "Everything you've taught me over 5 years. Every koan we've discussed. Every meditation instruction. All preserved here." "Preserved?" Mumon repeated thoughtfully. "Like pickled vegetables?" Akiko laughed at the comparison. "Something like that, so I can return to these teachings whenever I need them." "Show me your understanding of the teaching we discussed yesterday," Mumon said. Akiko reached for her most recent journal and began reading her notes. Mumon stopped her. "Not what you wrote. Your understanding, without the notes." Akiko tried to explain the teaching from memory, but found she couldn't. Her mind kept trying to recall what she had written, rather than expressing what she actually understood. The notes had become a barrier between her and direct understanding. "You've been writing instead of learning," Mumon said gently. "You've been preserving teachings on paper rather than absorbing them into your being. You have accumulated much, but understood little." Akiko felt defensive. "But these notes help me remember. Without them, I would forget." "What you forget wasn't truly learned," Mumon replied. "And what you truly learn doesn't need notes to remember. Knowledge that lives only on paper is dead knowledge. It has to live in you to be real knowledge." She picked up one of Akiko's journals and read a passage about meditation. "Do you remember writing this?" "Yes, from 3 years ago. You were teaching about working with a restless mind." "And do you work with a restless mind this way?" Mumon asked. Akiko realized she didn't. She had written the teaching down, but never actually integrated it into her practice. The notes gave her the illusion of learning without the reality of it. Mumon set down the journal. "Tonight, I want you to burn all these notes." "What?" "No. These represent years of work. These represent years of writing. That's not the same as years of learning. Burn them. If the teachings took root in you, they'll survive the burning. If they didn't, then keeping the notes is just a way of avoiding that truth." Akiko spent a sleepless night agonizing over this instruction. Her notes felt like treasures, like her spiritual wealth accumulated over the years. But she trusted Mumon, so the next evening, she built a fire and with trembling hands, began feeding her journals to the flames. As each notebook burned, she felt panic and loss, years of writing disappearing into smoke and ash. but she continued, page by page, until everything was gone. She sat looking at the ashes, feeling empty and devastated. The next morning, Moomin asked her to explain a teaching from 2 years ago. Without her notes to consult, Akiko had to reach for what she actually remembered, what had actually integrated into her understanding. She was surprised to find that she could explain the teaching, not in the exact words she had written, but in her own words that expressed real understanding. "You see?" Moomin said. "What truly became part of you survived the burning. What was only on paper is gone, but it was already gone in the sense that it wasn't really yours. You possessed the notes, but you didn't possess the understanding they were meant to point toward." Over the following weeks, something shifted in Akiko's learning. Without notes to rely on, she had to actually integrate teachings as they came. She had to pay a different kind of attention, not the attention of someone recording for later, but the attention of someone learning for now. She discovered that taking notes had been a way of deferring understanding. "I'll write this down and understand it later," she would think. But later never came. The act of writing created the illusion of learning while allowing actual learning to be postponed indefinitely. Now, without that crutch, she had to understand immediately. She had to ask questions in the moment rather than writing down words to puzzle over later. She had to practice teachings directly rather than preserving them for future practice. Her understanding deepened rapidly. The teachings weren't sitting on paper waiting to be reviewed. They were living in her actions, her responses, her way of being in the world. "Why did you have me burn the notes?" Akiko asked Moomin one day. "Was it to punish me for relying on them?" "Not punishment," Moomin replied. "Liberation. You were carrying a library but not living the teachings. The notes made you feel like a good student, like you were capturing and preserving wisdom. But actually, they were preventing you from being transformed by that wisdom. You were collecting teachings like butterflies in a jar, beautiful but dead, instead of learning to fly." She looked at Akiko directly. The teachings aren't meant to be possessed. They're meant to be embodied. You can't embody something while you're busy writing it down and filing it away. The burning freed you from the illusion that learning means accumulating words on paper. A fellow student who still took extensive notes heard about Akiko's burned journals and was horrified. "How can you not take notes? How will you remember everything?" "I don't remember everything," Akiko admitted. "I remember what matters. What doesn't stick naturally wasn't ready to be integrated anyway. Before, I had notes on hundreds of teachings I didn't understand or practice. Now I have no notes, but I actually live the teachings that have taken root." The other student wasn't convinced, but months later came back to Akiko. "I've been thinking about what you said. I realized I hide behind my notes. I write things down instead of changing my behavior. I accumulate teachings instead of applying them. Maybe I need to burn my notes too." "Maybe," Akiko said. "Or maybe you just need to recognize that the notes are a tool, not the goal. They can serve learning if you use them as temporary scaffolding that you eventually remove. But if you treat them as the achievement itself, they become obstacles." Years later, when Akiko became a teacher herself, she had an unusual policy. Students could take notes during the teachings, but at the end of each month, they had to burn them. If you understood, You don't need the notes, she would tell them. If you didn't understand, the notes won't help you. They'll just give you the illusion of understanding, while the real thing eludes you. Some students resisted this practice. But what if I forget important things? Then they weren't that important, Akiko would reply, or they weren't meant for you at this time. Trust that what you need to remember will stay with you. Trust that understanding that matters will integrate naturally. Let go of trying to capture and possess teachings. Let them flow through you, keeping what sticks and releasing what doesn't. One student said, "But I learn by writing. The act of writing helps me process and remember." Then write, Akiko allowed. But burn your notes afterward. Let writing be a process of learning, not a product of learning. Let it be the act of digestion, not the attempt at preservation. Write to understand in the moment, not to have something to refer back to. She showed them her empty shelves where journals used to be. I'm lighter now. I carry less paper, but more understanding. The teachings live in how I respond to difficulty, how I meet each moment, and how I treat people. They don't live in notes tucked away in storage. This is the difference between dead knowledge and living wisdom. Tonight, as you rest, what notes are you clinging to? What accumulations of knowledge or experience are you treating as possessions rather than processes? What have you written down, filed away, or tucked into memory with the intention of understanding later, but later never comes? You don't need to keep everything. You don't need to preserve every insight, remember every lesson, or capture every moment of learning. What truly transforms you doesn't need notes to survive. It lives in you, changes you, and becomes part of how you move through the world. Rest now in the understanding that learning isn't about accumulation, but about integration. That wisdom lives not on shelves, but in actions. The most important teachings don't need to be written down because they write themselves into your very being. Let yourself be like the burned journals, emptied of words but full of understanding, lighter in paper but heavier in wisdom, possessing less but being more. The notes were never the point. The understanding they pointed toward was the point. And that understanding needs no paper to live on. It lives in you. It always has. Rest now in that living wisdom, requiring no notes, no preservation, no recording. Just being, knowing, understanding from the inside out. In a coastal village where dangerous rocks lurked beneath the waves, there stood a lighthouse that had saved countless ships from destruction. The lighthouse keeper was a man named Tomo, who had tended the light faithfully for 20 years, never missing a night, never letting the beacon fail. Tomo took great pride in his work. Each evening as he lit the lamp, he would think about the ships that would see his light and know where the safe passage lay. He imagined grateful sailors steering clear of the rocks because of his vigilance. His purpose was clear, his contribution visible, his worth measured in ships that arrived safely rather than wrecking on the shore. But then came a period in Tomo's life when everything fell apart. His wife died after a long illness. His adult son, with whom he'd been close, moved to a distant city and rarely wrote. His closest friend in the village passed away suddenly. Within the span of 6 months, Tomo lost everyone who mattered most to him. He fell into a deep despair, He no longer felt the satisfaction he once had in his work. The lighthouse seemed meaningless, his life empty, his purpose hollow. He felt lost, as if he were stumbling through darkness with no light to guide him, no sense of direction, no hope that things would improve. Yet, despite his inner darkness, Tomo continued to light the lighthouse every night. It was a habit, a duty, the automatic continuation of what he had always done. But there was no joy in it anymore, no sense of meaning. He lit the lamp because that's what lighthouse keepers do, not because he felt it mattered. He would stand in the lamp room at night, watching the light sweep across the dark water, and think, I'm supposed to be the one providing light, but I'm drowning in darkness. I'm supposed to guide others to safety, but I'm completely lost in myself. What right do I have to stand here pretending to know the way when I can't find my own path? One stormy night, as Tomo stood in the lamp room feeling particularly hopeless, there was a knock at the lighthouse door. He descended to find a sailor, soaking wet, nearly hypothermic, who had been thrown from his ship when a wave swept over the deck. I saw your light, the sailor gasped as Tomo pulled him inside. I was in the water, being pulled toward the rocks. I thought I was going to die. Then I saw your light, and I swam toward it. Your light saved my life. Tomoe brought the man warm clothes, hot tea, and blankets. As the sailor recovered by the fire, he kept repeating his gratitude. If your light hadn't been there, I would have been smashed against the rocks. I couldn't see anything else, but I could see your light. It showed me which way to swim. After the sailor left the next morning, rescued by his ship, which had returned looking for him, Tomo sat for a long time thinking about what had happened. He had been so focused on his own inner darkness that he had forgotten what his light actually did. It didn't require him to feel enlightened. It didn't need him to be free of darkness himself. It just needed to shine. The sailor didn't care that the lighthouse keeper was lost and grieving. The sailor didn't need Tomo to have all the answers or to be living a perfect life. The sailor just needed the light to be there, marking the safe passage, showing where the dangers were. A Zen monk who lived at the village had heard about the rescued sailor. He came to visit Tomo at the lighthouse. I've noticed you've been struggling, the monk said gently. Since your losses, I see the darkness in you. Tomo nodded, too tired to pretend otherwise. I light this beacon every night, but I feel like a fraud. How can I guide others when I'm lost myself? How can I provide light when I'm full of darkness? The monk looked up at the lamp tower. Does the lighthouse need to understand navigation to be useful? Does it need to have sailed all the seas to show where the rocks are? Does it need to feel happy and fulfilled to save lives? No, Tomo admitted. It just needs to shine. Exactly, the monk said. You think your inner darkness disqualifies you from helping others, but actually, your willingness to keep the light burning despite your darkness makes your service even more valuable. You're not helping others because you have everything figured out. You're helping them because you do what needs to be done, regardless of how you feel. He touched Tomo's shoulder. Many people believe they can't help others until they're completely healed themselves. Until they've solved all their problems, found all their answers, achieved enlightenment or happiness or wholeness. But if everyone waited until they were completely well before helping others, no one would ever help anyone. We're all broken in some way. We're all stumbling in the darkness of one kind or another, but we can still hold lights for each other. Tomo felt something shift inside him. You're saying I can be lost and still guide others? You already are, the monk replied. You've been doing it every night. Your grief, your despair, your sense of being lost, none of that prevented the light from shining. None of that stopped you from doing what needed to be done. You think you're a fraud because you're suffering while helping others. But actually, you're demonstrating something important. Service doesn't require personal perfection. It requires showing up and doing what needs to be done. Over the following weeks, Tomo began to see his work differently. He was still grieving. He still felt lost much of the time. The darkness inside him hadn't disappeared. But he understood now that his inner state didn't invalidate his outer contribution. Ships still needed guidance. The light still saved lives. His pain didn't make the light less bright. He thought about all the people who probably felt as he did, broken, lost, inadequate, questioning their right to help others when they themselves were struggling. How many people stopped offering their gifts because they felt they weren't whole enough, healed enough, enlightened enough? A young woman from the village came to him one day troubled. She was training to be a healer, but felt overwhelmed by her own anxieties and doubts. How can I help heal others when I'm so broken myself? She asked. Tomo took her up to the lamp room and showed her the light. This lighthouse doesn't need to be whole to be useful. It just needs to do its job. You don't need to have conquered all your fears and healed all your wounds to help others. You just need to offer what you can offer. Your brokenness doesn't disqualify you from service. Sometimes it actually makes you better at it because you understand suffering from the inside. He told her about the sailor he had saved while feeling completely lost. The sailor didn't need me to be happy. He needed me to keep the light on. The people you help won't need you to be perfect. They'll need you to offer your skills, your compassion, your presence, whatever you're capable of giving. And you can give those things even while you're struggling. Word spread about the lighthouse keeper's teaching. People who had been holding back from helping others because of their own problems began to reconsider. The teacher who was battling depression realized she could still teach well, that her students didn't need her to be joyful, just knowledgeable and present. The counselor struggling with his own failed marriage recognized he could still help other couples, that his challenges didn't erase his insights. The mentor, dealing with doubt about his own life choices, saw that he could still guide younger people. That uncertainty about his own path didn't prevent him from illuminating options for others. Tomoe's grief gradually softened over time. Years passed, and while he never stopped missing his wife and feeling the absence of his son, the acute pain dulled into a quieter sadness. The darkness inside him became less consuming. But he never forgot the lesson of that period, that he had kept the light burning through his darkest time, that ships had been saved even while he felt lost, that his inner darkness hadn't stopped the outward light. One evening, many years later, an old sailor came to the lighthouse. "Do you remember me?" the sailor asked. "You saved my life 20 years ago. I was thrown overboard in a storm. I saw your light and swam to it." Tomoe did remember. That was the night I needed most to know that what I was doing mattered. Well, it mattered, the sailor said. I went on to have a family. 3 children, 7 grandchildren now. All of them exist because you kept that light burning. And you know what I learned that night? I learned that when you're drowning in darkness, you don't need someone who has all the answers. You just need someone who's holding a light, even if they're struggling to hold it, even if they're not sure why they're bothering. You just need the light. It doesn't matter if the keeper is lost. It matters that the light is there. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what lights you've been withholding because you feel too broken to offer them. What help have you refused to give because you don't feel qualified, whole, or enlightened enough? What guidance have you withheld because you yourself feel lost? You don't need to have everything figured out to help someone else. You don't need to be healed completely to offer healing. You don't need to be free of darkness to hold light for others. The lighthouse keeper's inner darkness didn't stop ships from being saved. Your inner struggles don't invalidate the contribution you can make. Keep your light burning, even in your dark nights. Not because you're perfect, but because someone out there is swimming in darkness toward whatever light they can find. Your light might be the one that saves them. And it doesn't matter that you feel lost. It only matters that you're still showing up, still doing what you can do, still offering what you can offer. Rest now in the understanding that you can be broken and still be useful, lost and still guide others, full of darkness and still provides light. The lighthouse doesn't need to understand the journey to mark the safe passage. It just needs to keep shining. So do you. Your inner darkness doesn't disqualify you from helping others. Sometimes it's what qualifies you most, because you understand what it's like to need a light in the darkness. Sleep now, lighthouse keeper, knowing that even in your darkest nights, your light has been saving lives. It always has been. It always will be. Continuing along the path of Zen insight, we pause now to hear a teaching about perception and hidden value. Listen carefully to the next story. In a garden temple, the monks kept a beautiful crane named Haku in a large bamboo enclosure. Haku had been brought to the temple as an injured chick, nursed back to health, and raised in the enclosure where he was safe from predators and provided with ample food. For 3 years, Haku lived comfortably in his bamboo home. The monks fed him daily, cleaned his space, and even spoke to him in gentle tones. He had everything a crane could need except freedom, though the monks assured themselves they were keeping him safe. One day, a traveling priest named Osho visited the temple and saw Haku in his enclosure. The priest noticed that Haku's wings had grown strong and full. He was clearly capable of flight, yet he never attempted to fly beyond the bamboo walls, even though portions of the enclosure were open to the sky. "Why doesn't your crane fly away?" Osho asked the monks. "He could if he wanted to," one monk replied. "We don't clip his wings." But he stays because he knows this is where his food comes, where he's safe, where he belongs. Osho watched Haku for several days. The crane would walk around his enclosure, occasionally stretching his wings, but never attempting actual flight. It was as if Haku had forgotten that flight was even possible, that his wings had any purpose beyond stretching. On his last day at the temple, Osho asked permission to enter Haku's enclosure. He approached the crane slowly, then suddenly clapped his hands and shouted, startling Haku into the air. The crane's wings opened instinctively, and for a moment, Haku was flying, truly flying, circling above the enclosure in surprise. But after only 2 circles, Haku landed back in his familiar corner, as if the brief flight had frightened rather than thrilled him. He settled back into his routine immediately, walking the same worn paths he always walked. The monks were angry. "You scared him! You could have hurt him!" "I showed him he could fly," Osho replied calmly, "but he chose to land." That choice tells me something important. Your crane is imprisoned not by bamboo walls, but by comfort. He could leave any time, but he won't, because the enclosure has become more familiar than freedom. He looked at the monks gathered around him. And before you judge Haku too harshly, ask yourselves, how are you different? How many of you are living in comfortable enclosures of your own making, never attempting to fly because the familiar is safer than the possible? One young monk, named Botan, was particularly struck by this question. He realized he had been at the temple for 5 years, had taken preliminary vows, but had never fully committed to the monastic life. He was comfortable in this in-between state, receiving the structure and security of monastery life without the full commitment it demanded. Like Haku, he had wings he never used. After Osho left, Botan couldn't stop thinking about the crane. He began to see Haku differently, not as a bird being kept safe, but as a bird being kept comfortable in a cage he could leave any time. And he began to see himself the same way. He started paying attention to all the ways the monastery had become his comfortable enclosure. He knew when every meal would come. He knew exactly what each day would bring. He had routines that felt safe, relationships that felt predictable, a life that felt controlled. And he realized this comfort was preventing him from attempting the flight that monastic life was actually meant to enable. The leap into full commitment, into genuine spiritual practice, into the risk and uncertainty that real transformation requires. "I've been living like Haku," Botan confessed to the abbot. "Safe and comfortable, but not really alive. Not really practicing, just walking the same familiar paths day after day." The abbot, who'd been troubled by Osho's words about the crane, nodded. "You're not alone." Many of us have made the monastery into a comfortable cage rather than a launching place. We've mistaken security for wisdom, routine for practice, comfort for peace. He gestured toward Haku's enclosure. The priest was right to startle the crane into flight. Not to frighten him, but to remind him what his wings were for. Perhaps we all need to be startled sometimes, reminded that we have wings we're not using, capabilities we're not exercising, flights we're not attempting, because the ground feels safer. The monks began to look at their own lives with new eyes. They noticed patterns of comfortable avoidance, ways they stayed safely within self-imposed limits, flights they could attempt but didn't. The monastery, meant to be a place of transformation, had become for many a place of comfortable stagnation. Gradually, changes began to happen. Monks who had been avoiding difficult practices began to attempt them. Commitments that had been postponed were made. Risks that had seemed too frightening were taken. Not everyone changed. Some preferred the comfortable enclosure, but many discovered they had wings they had forgotten about. As for Haku, the monks began to encourage him to fly, taking him to open areas and gently startling him into the air. At first, he would fly only briefly before landing back in familiar territory. But eventually, his flights grew longer. One day, Haku flew beyond the temple grounds entirely and didn't return. The monks felt both loss and joy. They had loved having Haku, but they recognized that keeping him comfortable had been keeping him caged. Setting him free, truly free, not just free within limits, was the compassionate thing, even though it meant losing him. Botan, watching Haku disappear into the distance, felt inspired. If a crane can remember how to fly after 3 years of comfortable captivity, then surely I can remember what I came here to do. I've been in my bamboo enclosure long enough. He took his final vows that week, fully committing to monastic life. It was terrifying in a way his comfortable half-commitment had never been. But it was also exhilarating, like stretching wings he had forgotten he possessed. Years later, when Botan had become a teacher, he would often tell the story of Haku the crane. "We all build comfortable enclosures," he would say. "Relationships that feel safe but limit growth. Jobs that provide security but prevent exploration. Routines that feel comforting but cage us. The bamboo walls look like protection, but they're actually prevention, preventing us from discovering what we're capable of, from attempting flights we were made for." Students would ask, "But how do we know when comfort has become a cage? When should we leave the enclosure?" "When you're walking the same paths day after day without growth," Botan would reply. "When you've stopped even looking at the sky. When you've forgotten you have wings. When the thought of flying fills you with fear rather than excitement. These are signs that comfort has become captivity, that the safe enclosure has become a prison you don't recognize as a prison because it's comfortable." He would pause, then add, "The tragedy isn't being in the enclosure. The tragedy is forgetting you can leave, forgetting you were made for flight, forgetting that your wings have purpose beyond stretching." Haku lived 3 years in comfortable captivity before someone reminded him he could fly. How many years will you live in yours before you remember? Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own bamboo enclosure. What comfortable cage have you built for yourself? What safe patterns have you established that prevent growth? What flights are you not attempting because staying grounded feels safer? You have wings. You've always had wings. The question isn't whether you're capable of flight. You are. The question is whether you've become so comfortable with the ground that you've forgotten that the sky is where you belong. Whether the bamboo enclosure feels so safe that you've stopped noticing it's still an enclosure. Rest tonight with this awareness. Tomorrow, you could fly. You could attempt something that terrifies you. You could leave the comfortable patterns and risk the unknown. You could stretch your wings, not just as exercise, but as preparation for actual flight. The cage isn't locked. It never was. You've just been comfortable enough that you forgot to try the door. Sleep now and dream of flying. Let some part of you remember what your wings are for. And when you wake, maybe, just maybe, you'll be ready to find out what happens when you actually use them. As we drift deeper into the still waters of Zen, a quiet teaching begins to rise, one that speaks of clarity and of value not always seen. Listen gently now. The next story begins. In the capital city lived a tea master named Soho, who had spent 50 years perfecting the art of the tea ceremony. His movements were flawless, his timing exact, his aesthetic sense refined beyond what most people could achieve in several lifetimes. Every detail of his ceremonies was considered and precise. The angle of the bowl, the temperature of the water, the moment to pass the tea, the positioning of each implement. Soho's ceremonies were legendary. People would wait years for an invitation to attend. Wealthy patrons offered fortunes to have Soho perform ceremonies for their guests. Other tea masters studied his techniques, trying to replicate his perfection. But Soho himself had grown troubled. Despite his technical mastery, despite the acclaim, he felt his ceremonies had become performances rather than genuine expressions of tea mind. He was so focused on executing each movement perfectly that he had lost connection to the spirit beneath the movements. His ceremonies were flawless, but somehow empty. On his 70th birthday, Soho decided to retire from public ceremonies. He would perform one final tea ceremony, a farewell to his long career, and then step away to live simply in a small temple. He prepared meticulously for this final ceremony. He invited only his closest students and a few respected elders who had followed his work for decades. He selected implements he had used for years, choosing each for its history and meaning. He practiced the movements daily in the weeks leading up to the ceremony, ensuring everything would be perfect. The day of the ceremony arrived. Soho entered the tea room with his usual grace, began with his usual precision. His guests watched in respectful silence, knowing they were witnessing a master's final performance. Then, midway through the ceremony, something unexpected happened. As Soho reached for the tea bowl, his hand trembled slightly. Whether from age, emotion, or simple nervousness, he couldn't say. The tremor caused him to fumble the bowl. It didn't fall or break, but his grip was clumsy, his movement awkward. The flow of the ceremony was disrupted by this imperfect moment. Soho's first instinct was mortification. After 50 years of perfect execution, his final ceremony was marred by a clumsy mistake. But then something shifted in him. The mistake had broken his focus on perfection, and in that break, he suddenly felt present in a way he hadn't been during a ceremony in years. He picked up the bowl, not with perfect grace, but with simple honesty, with the actual movement of an old man holding a bowl. He continued the ceremony, but something had changed. He was no longer performing perfectly. He was just making tea, sharing tea, being present with his guests. The movements that followed weren't as technically flawless as usual, but they had a quality his perfect performances had lacked. They were real. They were Soho actually being here, making tea, connecting with his guests, rather than Soho executing a perfect reproduction of the tea master role. When the ceremony ended, there was a long silence. Then one of the elder guests spoke. "That was the finest tea ceremony I have ever experienced." Soho was confused. "But I made mistakes. The execution wasn't clean." "The execution was finally clean," the elder replied. "Clean of performance, clean of ego, clean of the need to be perfect. For the first time in decades, I saw you actually making tea rather than demonstrating how tea should be made. Your fumble was the most important moment of the ceremony. It dropped you out of performance and into presence." Another guest agreed. "I've attended 6 of your ceremonies over the years. They were all technically superior to today's. but this one touched me in a way the others never did. The imperfection made it human. It made it real. It made it about tea rather than about perfection. Soho sat with this feedback for a long time. He realized that his 50-year pursuit of perfect execution had taken him away from genuine expression. He had become so skilled at performing the tea ceremony that he had forgotten how to simply make tea with presence and care. "I thought mastery meant perfect execution," Soho told his students later. "I thought the goal was to perform each movement so exactly that no flaw could be found. But that kind of mastery is dead. It's impressive but not alive. Today, when I fumbled and had to let go of perfection, I finally rediscovered what tea ceremony is actually about. Presence, connection, the simple act of sharing tea with other humans." He looked at his hands, still slightly trembling. "These old hands that made a mistake taught me more than 50 years of perfect practice. They taught me that perfect execution becomes perfect only when you stop trying to perfect it, when you let go of performance and sink into presence." One student asked, "So should we not practice? Should we not work toward technical excellence?" "Practice," Soho replied. "Develop your technique. But don't let technique become an end in itself. Practice until the movements are natural, then let go of trying to perform them perfectly. Use your technique to support presence, not to replace it. Master the form so completely that you can forget the form and just be here, making tea." He picked up a tea bowl, holding it with the same slight tremble. "See this imperfection? This is actually perfection because it's real. It's an old man's hand actually holding a bowl. The steady, flawless grip I cultivated for decades was impressive, but it was also a kind of lie it hid my actual hand behind a perfect performance. This trembling hand is honest, and honesty is more important than perfection." In the weeks following his final ceremony, Soho began making tea in a completely different way. He still had all his technical skills, all his aesthetic sensitivity, but he used them lightly, allowing imperfection, welcoming the unexpected, staying present with what was actually happening rather than executing a mental script. He made tea for strangers, for children, for anyone who wanted to share a bowl. These weren't formal ceremonies with guests and perfect settings. They were just tea, made with care, shared with presence. And people felt more touched by these simple offerings than they had by his legendary perfect ceremonies. "You've become a greater tea master by letting go of mastery," one visitor observed. "I've become an actual tea master by letting go of the performance of mastery," Soho clarified. "I was skilled before, but I wasn't real. Now I'm both skilled and real. The skill supports the reality rather than replacing it. That's the difference." A young tea student struggling to perfect his own technique asked Soho for guidance. "How do I know when my practice is good enough? When can I stop trying to perfect my movements? When perfection becomes a barrier rather than a path," Soho replied. "Practice until the movements are natural and trustworthy. Then let go of trying to make them perfect and just let them be. The movement from practice to performance to presence, that's the journey. Most people stop at performance, endlessly perfecting their execution. The final step is letting go of perfection and discovering presence." He made tea for the young student, his hands moving with practiced skill, but also with slight tremors, small imperfections, human reality. See how I make tea now? I'm not performing or demonstrating. I'm just making tea. The years of practice allow me to do it well, but letting go of perfection allows me to do it truly. Both are necessary, but the second is what makes it complete. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what you've been perfecting, performing, trying to execute flawlessly. What would happen if you let your hands tremble slightly? If you allowed imperfection? If you stopped performing mastery and just did the thing itself, present and real? Perfect execution is impressive, but presence is what actually connects, what actually matters, what actually makes any practice complete. You've practiced enough. You've refined enough. Now it's time to let go of perfection and discover what's on the other side. Not sloppiness, not carelessness, but genuine presence that includes both skill and imperfection, both mastery and humanity. Rest now in this completion. Let yourself fumble slightly. Let yourself be real rather than perfect. The Tea Master's Last Cup teaches that the journey ends not in flawless execution, but in authentic presence. You've arrived, not at perfection, but at something better, yourself, skilled and real, doing what you do with care and presence, and the slight tremble of actual human hands. That's perfection. That's the completion. That's the teaching. Sleep now, no longer performing, just being. This is enough. You are enough. The perfect becomes perfect when you stop trying to perfect it. In a garden temple, the monks kept a beautiful crane named Haku in a large bamboo enclosure. Haku had been brought to the temple as an injured chick, nursed back to health, and raised in the enclosure where he was safe from predators and provided with ample food. For 3 years, Haku lived comfortably in his bamboo home. The monks fed him daily, cleaned his space, and even spoke to him in gentle tones. He had everything a crane could need except freedom, though the monks assured themselves they were keeping him safe. One day, a traveling priest named Osho visited the temple and saw Haku in his enclosure. The priest noticed that Haku's wings had grown strong and full. He was clearly capable of flight, yet he never attempted to fly beyond the bamboo walls, even though portions of the enclosure were open to the sky. "Why doesn't your crane fly away?" Osho asked the monks. "He could if he wanted to," one monk replied. "We don't clip his wings." But he stays because he knows this is where his food comes, where he's safe, where he belongs. Osho watched Haku for several days. The crane would walk around his enclosure, occasionally stretching his wings, but never attempting actual flight. It was as if Haku had forgotten that flight was even possible, that his wings had any purpose beyond stretching. On his last day at the temple, Osho asked permission to enter Haku's enclosure. He approached the crane slowly, then suddenly clapped his hands and shouted, startling Haku into the air. The crane's wings opened instinctively, and for a moment, Haku was flying, truly flying, circling above the enclosure in surprise. But after only 2 circles, Haku landed back in his familiar corner, as if the brief flight had frightened rather than thrilled him. He settled back into his routine immediately, walking the same worn paths he always walked. The monks were angry. "You scared him! You could have hurt him!" "I showed him he could fly," Osho replied calmly, "but he chose to land." That choice tells me something important. Your crane is imprisoned not by bamboo walls, but by comfort. He could leave any time, But he won't, because the enclosure has become more familiar than freedom. He looked at the monks gathered around him. And before you judge Haku too harshly, ask yourselves, how are you different? How many of you are living in comfortable enclosures of your own making, never attempting to fly because the familiar is safer than the possible? One young monk, named Botan, was particularly struck by this question. He realized he had been at the temple for 5 years, had taken preliminary vows, but had never fully committed to the monastic life. He was comfortable in this in-between state, receiving the structure and security of monastery life without the full commitment it demanded. Like Haku, he had wings he never used. After Osho left, Botan couldn't stop thinking about the crane. He began to see Haku differently, not as a bird being kept safe, but as a bird being kept comfortable in a cage he could leave any time. And he began to see himself the same way. He started paying attention to all the ways the monastery had become his comfortable enclosure. He knew when every meal would come. He knew exactly what each day would bring. He had routines that felt safe, relationships that felt predictable, a life that felt controlled. And he realized this comfort was preventing him from attempting the flight that monastic life was actually meant to enable. The leap into full commitment, into genuine spiritual practice, into the risk and uncertainty that real transformation requires. I've been living like Haku, Botan confessed to the abbot, safe and comfortable, but not really alive. Not really practicing, just walking the same familiar paths day after day. The abbot, who'd been troubled by Osho's words about the crane, nodded. You're not alone. Many of us have made the monastery into a comfortable cage, rather than a launching place. We've mistaken security for wisdom, routine for practice, comfort for peace. He gestured toward Haku's enclosure. The priest was right to startle the crane into flight, not to frighten him, but to remind him what his wings were for. Perhaps we all need to be startled sometimes, reminded that we have wings we're not using, capabilities we're not exercising, flights we're not attempting, because the ground feels safer. The monks began to look at their own lives with new eyes. They noticed patterns of comfortable avoidance, ways they stayed safely within self-imposed limits, flights they could attempt but didn't. The monastery, meant to be a place of transformation, had become for many a place of comfortable stagnation. Gradually, changes began to happen. Monks who had been avoiding difficult practices began to attempt them. Commitments that had been postponed were made. Risks that had seemed too frightening were taken. Not everyone changed. Some preferred the comfortable enclosure, but many discovered they had wings they had forgotten about. As for Haku, the monks began to encourage him to fly, taking him to open areas and gently startling him into the air. At first, he would fly only briefly before landing back in familiar territory, but eventually, his flights grew longer. One day, Haku flew beyond the temple grounds entirely and didn't return. The monks felt both loss and joy. They had loved having Haku, but they recognized that keeping him comfortable had been keeping him caged. Setting him free, truly free, not just free within limits, was the compassionate thing, even though it meant losing him. Botan, watching Haku disappear into the distance, felt inspired. If a crane can remember how to fly after 3 years of comfortable captivity, then surely I can remember what I came here to do. I've been in my bamboo enclosure long enough. He took his final vows that week, fully committing to monastic life. It was terrifying in a way his comfortable half-commitment had never been. But it was also exhilarating, like stretching wings he had forgotten he possessed. Years later, when Botan had become a teacher, he would often tell the story of Haku the crane. "We all build comfortable enclosures," he would say. "Relationships that feel safe but limit growth. Jobs that provide security but prevent exploration. Routines that feel comforting but cage us. The bamboo walls look like protection, but they're actually prevention, preventing us from discovering what we're capable of, from attempting flights we were made for." Students would ask, "But how do we know when comfort has become a cage? When should we leave the enclosure?" "When you're walking the same paths day after day without growth," Botan would reply. "When you've stopped even looking at the sky. When you've forgotten you have wings. When the thought of flying fills you with fear rather than excitement. These are signs that comfort has become captivity, that the safe enclosure has become a prison you don't recognize as a prison because it's comfortable." He would pause, then add, "The tragedy isn't being in the enclosure. The tragedy is forgetting you can leave, forgetting you were made for flight, forgetting that your wings have purpose beyond stretching." Haku lived 3 years in comfortable captivity before someone reminded him he could fly. How many years will you live in yours before you remember? Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own bamboo enclosure. What comfortable cage have you built for yourself? What safe patterns have you established that prevent growth? What flights are you not attempting because staying grounded feels safer? You have wings. You've always had wings. The question isn't whether you're capable of flight. You are. The question is whether you've become so comfortable with the ground that you've forgotten that the sky is where you belong. Whether the bamboo enclosure feels so safe that you've stopped noticing it's still an enclosure. Rest tonight with this awareness. Tomorrow, you could fly. You could attempt something that terrifies you. You could leave the comfortable patterns and risk the unknown. You could stretch your wings, not just as exercise, but as preparation for actual flight. The cage isn't locked. It never was. You've just been comfortable enough that you forgot to try the door. Sleep now and dream of flying. Let some part of you remember what your wings are for. And when you wake, maybe, just maybe, you'll be ready to find out what happens when you actually use them. With each breath, we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen, where the smallest stone may hold the greatest truth. Here starts the next story. At the edge of a village stood a house whose small garden received almost no direct sunlight. Tall buildings on either side cast shadows that leave the garden in shade for all but an hour each day. The previous owners had tried repeatedly to grow sun-loving flowers and vegetables, but everything either died or grew weak and spindly, stretching desperately toward the brief sliver of light. When Yuki moved into the house, neighbors warned her about the garden. "Nothing grows there," they said. "The shade is too deep. Better to pave it over and use it for storage." But Yuki looked at the shaded space differently. "It's not that nothing can grow here," she said. "It's that sun-loving plants can't grow here. The garden isn't bad. It's just suited for different things than the previous owners were trying to grow." She began researching plants that thrived in shade, ferns that loved the dim moisture, hostas with broad leaves that caught what little light appeared, shade-loving flowers that bloomed in muted colors, but with delicate beauty. Instead of fighting the garden's nature, she worked with it. Within a year, Yuki's shaded garden was lush and beautiful. It didn't look like sunny gardens with their bright flowers and robust vegetables. It had a different aesthetic, subtle, cool, mysterious. The greens were deeper, the flowers were more delicate. The whole space had a quality of quiet richness that sun-blasted gardens never achieved. Neighbors who had declared the space hopeless came to see what Yuki had created. They were amazed, though some were still dismissive. "It's pretty," one neighbor said, "but it's not a real garden. Real gardens have tomatoes and sunflowers and bright colors. Your garden is just making the best of bad conditions." "Are it conditions bad?" Yuki asked. "Or just different conditions?" "These ferns and hostas are barely surviving. They're thriving. They're doing exactly what they evolved to do in exactly the kind of environment they need. The previous owners failed because they tried to grow sun plants in shade. I'm succeeding because I'm growing shade plants in shade." She touched a particularly lush fern. "This plant would die in full sun. It needs shade. For this fern, my garden isn't difficult conditions, it's ideal conditions. The mistake is measuring all gardens by sun garden standards and calling everything else deficient." A young woman named Hannah, who lived nearby, was struck by this perspective. Hannah had always felt like she was growing in the shade in difficult circumstances that made the kind of success others achieved impossible for her. She had health issues that limited her energy. She lived in poverty, which restricted her opportunities. She lacked the family support that others took for granted. Everyone told her she needed to overcome these limitations, to find more light, to transform her difficult conditions into easier ones. But what if, like Yuki's garden, she just needed to stop trying to grow like a sun plant and instead discover how to thrive as a shade plant? She came to talk with Yuki about this idea. "I feel like I'm always failing," Hana admitted, "because I can't achieve what healthy, wealthy people with family support achieve. I'm trying to grow tomatoes in shade, basically. But I don't know what the equivalent of shade plants would be for a human life." Yuki walked her through the garden, explaining her choices. "See how I chose plants that need less energy? That's like you choosing work that fits your energy levels rather than jobs that demand more than you can give. See how I selected plants that thrive in cool, moist conditions? That's like you finding strengths that develop specifically because of your limitations, not despite them." She pointed to a particularly beautiful shade flower. "This would never survive in full sun. Its delicate petals would burn. But here, protected from harsh light, it blooms with a beauty that sun lovers can't achieve." Your limitations might protect you from certain kinds of harm while allowing you to develop qualities that people in easier conditions never develop. Hana began to reconsider her entire life. What if she stopped measuring herself by sun garden standards? What if she found shade garden ways to thrive? She had deep empathy, probably developed through her own suffering. She had patience, learned through chronic illness. She had creativity in making do with little, born from poverty. These weren't consolation prizes for failing at normal success. These were actual strengths. shade plant qualities that were valuable in themselves. She started making different choices. She took a job that paid less but required less energy, allowing her to work sustainably rather than constantly burning out. She developed friendships with others who lived in shade, creating community with people who understood difficult circumstances. She stopped apologizing for needing things that others didn't need, recognizing that shade plants legitimately need different care than sun plants. Word spread about Yuki's garden and the perspective it represented. People who felt they were growing in difficult conditions began to see themselves differently. A man with learning disabilities stopped trying to compete in academic environments and found work that used his practical intelligence. A woman with anxiety stopped forcing herself into high-stress social situations and built a life that honored her need for quiet. A family with limited income stopped feeling inadequate for not achieving wealth and found richness in their strong relationships. The shade garden teaching, as people began to call it, spread beyond individuals to organizations. A school started creating shade garden programs for students who couldn't thrive in standard classroom environments. A business developed positions specifically designed for people with limitations that made traditional jobs difficult. A community center created spaces for people who needed accommodations that mainstream spaces didn't provide. Not everyone appreciated this perspective. Some critics said it encouraged people to accept limitations rather than overcoming them. "You're telling people to give up," they argued, "to accept that they can't thrive in normal conditions rather than working to change their circumstances." Yuki would answer these critics by walking them through her garden. "Look at these plants. Should they be working to become sun plants? Should they be trying to overcome their shade-thriving nature? Or should they be celebrated for being excellent at what they actually are?" She would point to a struggling plant that needed more light. "Sometimes you do need to change conditions. This plant is genuinely in the wrong place. It needs to be moved to a more light-filled place. But most of these plants, they're exactly where they should be, thriving in conditions that sun plants would call impossible." The question isn't whether to overcome all limitations. The question is whether your limitations are like shade for a shade plant, the right conditions for your actual nature, or like shade for a sun plant, wrong conditions that need to change. A teacher named Nobuo applied this to his classroom. He stopped trying to make all students thrive in the same way. He recognized that some students were sun plants who needed bright, fast-paced, competitive environments. Others were shade plants that needed quiet, slow, supportive conditions. Trying to make shade plant students compete in sun plant ways was as futile as trying to grow ferns in full sun. He created different pathways through his curriculum, different ways to demonstrate learning, and different environments within his classroom. And he found that students he had previously considered struggling were actually thriving. They just needed shade garden conditions to show what they could do. Years later, Yuki's garden became something of a pilgrimage site for people living in difficult circumstances. They would come to see that lushness was possible even in shade, that beauty didn't require ideal conditions, that thriving could look different from what sunny gardens showed. Yuki, now elderly, would sit in her garden talking with visitors. "The hardest thing," she would tell them, "is stopping comparing yourself to sun gardens. Stop measuring your lushness by their standards. Stop trying to be bright when your beauty is subtle. Once you accept that you're a shade garden, once you stop apologizing for it and start working with it, you discover possibilities you never knew existed. She would touch the ferns and hostas she had planted decades earlier, now mature and magnificent. These plants are barely surviving in bad conditions. They're thriving in ideal conditions for their nature. The shade isn't their obstacle, it's their element. And the same might be true for you. Tonight, as you rest, you might reconsider the shade you're growing in. The difficult conditions you've been taught to see as obstacles might actually be the right environment for who you actually are. Not who you think you should be, not who sun gardens demand, but who you actually are. Stop trying to grow sun plants in shade. Stop measuring yourself by standards designed for different conditions. Start asking, what does thriving look like for a shade plant? What can I grow that loves these exact conditions? What beauty can emerge specifically because of these limitations, not despite them? Rest now in your shade garden. Let yourself be a fern, a hosta, a delicate shade flower. Stop burning yourself trying to bloom in full sun. Sink into the cool moisture of your actual conditions and discover what wants to grow there. Shade isn't a deficiency. It's just a different light. And different light creates different beauty. Trust that yours is worth growing. There was a painter named Hero who specialized in landscapes, particularly sunsets. He would travel to scenic locations, set up his easel, and capture the magnificent colors of the evening sky. His paintings were admired and purchased by wealthy collectors throughout the region, but Hero harbored a secret anxiety. He worried that beauty only existed when someone was there to witness it. If a sunset occurred and no one saw it, was it still beautiful? If a mountain stood in perfect light, but no human eye appreciated it, did that beauty mean anything? This philosophical worry grew into an obsession. Hero began to feel that his purpose as an artist was essential, that without him and others like him to witness and record beauty, that beauty was somehow wasted, meaningless, lost. He expressed this concern to a Zen monk named Daigu, who lived near one of Hero's favorite painting locations. If I didn't come here to paint these sunsets, they would just happen and disappear with no one to appreciate them. Doesn't that seem like a waste? Daigu looked at Hero with gentle amusement. Let me ask you something. Before humans existed, before there were any conscious beings to witness them, did sunsets occur? Yes, I suppose so. And were they beautiful? How could they be beautiful if there was no one to see them? Ah, Daigu said. So you believe beauty is created by the observer rather than existing in the observed? This question troubled Hero. He had always thought beauty was a quality inherent in things, but maybe he was wrong. Maybe beauty was just a human interpretation, a meaning we project onto neutral phenomena. Daigu continued, Tonight, stay at my temple. In the morning, before dawn, I'll show you something. That night, Hero could barely sleep, wondering what the monk would show him. Before sunrise, Daigu woke him and led him to a secluded valley far from any human habitation. We're going to leave now, Daigu said, and we're not going to look back. This evening, the sunset will occur here, with no human to witness it. According to your theory, that sunset will not be beautiful because there's no one to appreciate it. But how will we know? Hero asked. Exactly, Daigu smiled. How will we know? And does not knowing change anything about what actually happens? They left the valley and returned to the temple. All day, Hiro thought about the sunset occurring in that empty valley. The sky is going through its evening transformation with no human eye to see it. Colors blooming and fading with no one to call them beautiful. That evening, sitting with Daigu as the sun set over the temple, Hiro said, "Right now, in that valley, the sunset is happening. And it's the same sky, the same light, the same colors as here. The only difference is, we're not there to see it." "And?" Daigu prompted. "And I realize my presence doesn't create the beauty. It just allows me to participate in it. The sunset doesn't need me to witness it to be what it is. My witnessing is a gift I receive, not a gift I give to the sunset." Daigu nodded. "The mountains were beautiful before humans arrived and will be beautiful after humans are gone. The sunset performs its daily miracle whether anyone watches or not. Beauty is not dependent on observers. It exists. Our observation of it is our privilege, not our creation or our responsibility." This understanding transformed Hiro's relationship with his art. He had been painting with a sense of urgent mission, as if he needed to capture and preserve beauty before it was lost to obscurity. Now, he painted with gratitude, recognizing that he was participating in beauty, not rescuing it. His paintings changed. They became less about controlling and capturing, and more about celebrating and sharing. Critics said his later work had a quality of joy that his earlier, technically superior work had lacked. One student asked Hiro, "If beauty exists without observers, why paint at all? Why bother witnessing it?" "Because witnessing is a joy," Hiro replied, "not a duty. I don't paint because the sunset needs me. I paint because I need the sunset. Being present to beauty enriches me. Sharing that experience with others through my paintings is a gift I offer. But the beauty itself doesn't depend on my offering. It simply is." He told the student about the sunset in the empty valley. "Somewhere right now, a magnificent sunset is occurring that no human will ever see. No photograph will capture it. No painting will record it. It will happen and end and be gone forever from human knowledge. And that's perfect. That sunset doesn't exist for us. It exists because the earth turns and light bends and atmosphere scatters color. We're fortunate when we get to witness it, but our witnessing isn't required." This lesson extended beyond sunsets to everything in Hiro's life. He realized he'd been placing himself at the center of existence, as if things needed him to matter. But actually, everything had its own existence, its own worth, independent of his awareness or appreciation. The tree in his garden was a tree whether he noticed it or not. The bird singing in the morning was completing its nature whether he heard it or not. The stars were shining whether he looked up at them or not. His presence as an observer was optional, not essential. Everything existed quite fully without him. "This could feel depressing," he told Daigu later. "Realizing that I'm not essential, that everything would continue without me." "Or it could feel liberating," Daigu replied. "You don't have to carry the burden of making things matter. They already matter. Your role is simply to participate, to witness, to celebrate when you're fortunate enough to be present." This is a much lighter burden than thinking you must observe everything to validate its existence. Years later, when Hero was old and knew he was dying, a young painter came to him, worried. "When I die, who will paint these mountains? Who will witness these sunsets? Will all this beauty be wasted?" Hero smiled, remembering his own younger anxieties. "The beauty will be what it has always been, complete and independent of observers. Other people will witness it. And even if no people witnessed it, it would still be itself, still be beautiful in its own right. You're not the author of beauty. You're just a fortunate participant in it. Paint while you can, witness what you're able to, and rest easy knowing that beauty doesn't depend on you to exist." Tonight, as you rest, you might find relief in this teaching. The world doesn't need you to be constantly observing, appreciating, and validating it for it to have worth. Your life has value. Your presence matters, but not because everything depends on you. Rather, because you get to participate in existence, to witness beauty, to experience being alive. This moment, right now, is happening whether you're paying attention or not. The universe is unfolding whether you're conscious of it or not. You can rest completely, releasing all concern that you need to be witnessing and validating and appreciating every moment. Some moments will happen without you. Some beauty will bloom and fade unseen. And that's perfect. That's how it should be. Rest in the understanding that you're not the center of existence but a participant in it, a grateful guest, not a required audience. Let the world exist without your constant attention. Let beauty be beautiful, whether you're watching or not. This is freedom. This is peace. This is the deep rest of knowing you can stop, can close your eyes, can let go completely, and everything will continue being exactly what it is. The path of Zen unfolds like morning mist, soft and patient. In this next tale, we are invited to see, beyond appearance, into essence. Listen carefully to the next story. There was a master calligrapher named Kenzo who had spent 40 years perfecting his craft. He could write each character with flawless precision, every stroke exactly as the ancient masters had prescribed. His work was technically perfect, exhibited in galleries, and purchased by collectors who valued his adherence to classical standards. But Kenzo had a secret dissatisfaction. Despite the praise and recognition, his work felt lifeless to him. Each piece was an exercise in replication, a demonstration of technique, but nothing more. He was copying perfection that had been established centuries ago, adding nothing of himself, discovering nothing new. One day, an important patron commissioned a piece for a temple dedication. The character to be written was Mu, meaning emptiness or void. Kenzo prepared carefully, mixing his ink to exactly the right consistency, selecting his finest brush, and setting up his workspace with meticulous attention to every detail. He had practiced this character thousands of times. He knew exactly how it should look. He visualized every stroke in his mind, preparing to execute it perfectly. But as he positioned his brush above the paper, his cat, who normally slept quietly in the corner during his work, suddenly leapt onto the table. The cat's paw hit Kenzo's arm just as he was beginning the first stroke. The brush dragged across the paper in a completely unintended direction, creating a wild, irregular mark that bore no resemblance to proper calligraphy. Kenzo's first reaction was anger. The perfect paper was ruined. Hours of preparation wasted. He would have to start over, and he was already behind schedule. He grabbed the ruined piece, intending to crumple it and throw it away, but something made him pause. He looked at the mark more carefully. The stroke was wild, yes, completely improper by classical standards. But it had an energy, a life, a spontaneous quality that none of his careful, perfect strokes ever achieved. It looked like emptiness, like void, like the very essence of mu, in a way his technically correct versions never had. The mark captured something real about emptiness, its unpredictability, its resistance to control, its indifference to our intentions. His planned perfect versions had been illustrations of the concept. This accidental mark was somehow the thing itself. Kenzo sat staring at this mistake for over an hour. Finally, he decided to build the rest of the character around it, incorporating the wild stroke instead of starting over. The final piece was unlike anything he had ever created. It combined his technical skill with this element of pure accident, planned mastery with unplanned spontaneity. When he delivered the piece to his patron, he apologized. "I must confess, this isn't what I planned." My cat interfered, and the first stroke went completely wrong. I tried to salvage the piece, but it's not traditional calligraphy. I understand if you want me to create a new one. The patron studied the work in silence for a long time. Finally, he said, "This is the finest piece you've ever created." "But it's wrong," Kenzo protested. "The first stroke violates every principle of proper form." "It's alive," the patron replied. "Your other work is beautiful, technically flawless, but it's like looking at a preserved flower. This piece is like seeing a flower growing wild. It has breath in it, spontaneity, the quality of something happening right now, rather than being carefully reconstructed from the past." He hung the piece in the temple, and people came from across the region to see it. Other calligraphers studied it, trying to understand how Kenzo had achieved such vitality. Some tried to recreate the effect by deliberately making mistakes, but these forced accidents never had the same quality. The life in Kenzo's piece came from the genuineness of the accident, not from calculated imperfection. A Zen master who viewed the piece said to Kenzo, "Your cat understood something you had forgotten, that true art comes from responding to the moment, not from executing a plan. For 40 years, you've been copying the past. In one moment of accident, you created something present." "But I can't plan accidents," Kenzo said. "I can't make this happen deliberately." "Exactly," the master replied. "That's why it worked. Your planning mind, your control, your perfection, all of that had to be interrupted for something real to emerge. The cat was your teacher." From that day forward, Kenzo's approach to calligraphy changed. He still practiced technique, still maintained his skills, but he stopped trying to control every aspect of the outcome. He began leaving space for accident, for the unexpected, for the moment to contribute its own wisdom. Sometimes he would start a piece without complete preparation, letting the consistency of the ink vary, allowing the paper to be slightly wrinkled, welcoming small imperfections. Sometimes he would work faster than was comfortable, not giving himself time to calculate every movement. Sometimes he would deliberately do something unusual, breaking a rule to see what would happen. Not every piece succeeded, many experiments failed, but the successful pieces had a quality his earlier perfect work had lacked: presence, immediacy, life. They felt like they were happening rather than being displayed. They invited the viewer into an experience rather than presenting a completed achievement. Other calligraphers criticized this departure from classical standards. Kenzo has abandoned proper technique, they said. He's making mistakes deliberately. This isn't true calligraphy. But Kenzo understood something they didn't. Technique wasn't being abandoned. It was being liberated. He had spent 40 years building technical mastery. Now he was learning what to do with that mastery, not to control and perfect, but to create conditions where truth could emerge spontaneously. The technique serves spontaneity, he would tell students. You practice until the movements are natural, until you don't have to think about them. Then you let go of trying to be perfect and allow something real to happen. The years of practice give you the skills. The letting go gives you the art. One student asked, "But how do you know when to let go? How do you know when you've practiced enough?" "You don't," Kenzo admitted. "I practiced for 40 years before my cat taught me to let go. Maybe that was too long. Maybe it wasn't long enough. The point isn't reaching some perfect amount of preparation. The point is remaining open to the moment when control needs to give way to spontaneity." He showed the student his temple piece with its wild first stroke. "I could never recreate this exactly. I could make similar pieces, but this particular mark came from this particular moment of accident. That's what makes it true. It's not a reproducible technique. It's a response to what actually happened." Years later, when Kenzo was old, he was asked to demonstrate calligraphy for the emperor. It was considered a great honor. Most calligraphers prepared extensively for such occasions, practicing for weeks to ensure a perfect demonstration. Kenzo prepared differently. He practiced just enough to be warmed up, then went to the demonstration with no fixed plan. He would respond to the moment, to the energy in the room, to whatever impulse arose. It was terrifying and exhilarating. As he stood before the emperor with brush and paper, he felt all his years of perfect control wanting to take over. The safe thing would be to execute a flawless classical piece. But instead, he paused, breathed, and let go of control. What emerged was neither perfectly planned nor completely accidental. It was something in between: technique meeting moment, skill dancing with spontaneity, the practiced hand responding to the unpracticed impulse. The character he created had both mastery and wildness, both tradition and innovation. When he finished, the emperor was silent for a moment, then said, "I have seen many demonstrations of perfect technique. This is the first time I've seen calligraphy that felt alive. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider where you're over-controlling, over-planning, and trying to perfect everything before you act. What would happen if you made space for accident, for spontaneity, for the moment to contribute its own wisdom? What if your careful plans are actually preventing something more true from emerging?" The perfect mistake teaches that life isn't lived according to plan. The most authentic moments come when planning gives way to presence, when control releases into response, when the prepared hand meets the unprepared moment. You don't need to have everything figured out. You don't need perfect execution. You need technique in the service of spontaneity, skill as a foundation for letting go. Rest now in the space between planning and accident, between control and release. Let yourself be like Kenzo's brush, prepared by practice, but freed from the need to be perfect. Tomorrow might bring a cat leaping onto your carefully prepared plans. Let it. The interruption might be the teacher. The accident might be the truth. The mistake might be perfect. In the hush of understanding, Zen offers us another glimpse of what it means to recognize worth not by weight or shine, but by presence. Here starts the next story. A young man named Tetsu came to study with a famous Zen master named Bankei. Tetsu had read many books about Buddhism and philosophy. He arrived full of questions, eager to test his understanding against the master's wisdom. On his first day, Bankei asked Tetsu, "What do you know about Zen?" Tetsu was ready for this question. He began to explain the concepts he had learned: emptiness, Buddha nature, the middle way, non-duality. He spoke for 20 minutes, demonstrating his knowledge, occasionally glancing at Bankei to see if the master was impressed. When Tetsu finally finished, Bankei said simply, "What else?" Tetsu was confused. "What do you mean, what else?" "You've told me what you know about Zen. Now tell me what you don't know." "Well," Tetsu hesitated. This wasn't a question he had prepared for. "I suppose there are advanced teachings I haven't encountered yet, and practical applications I'm still learning." "That's not what I asked," Bankei said. "I asked what you don't know. Not what you haven't learned yet, but what you genuinely don't know and recognize as unknowable." Tetsu was silent. He had spent years accumulating knowledge, thinking that was the path to wisdom. The idea of deliberately acknowledging what he didn't know felt like admitting defeat. "Come back tomorrow," Bankei said, "with a list of everything you don't know." Tetsu spent all evening trying to complete this impossible assignment. Every time he wrote "I don't know X," he would realize that he did know something about X, or could figure it out, or could look it up. By midnight, his page was blank. He couldn't genuinely claim not to know anything because he could always imagine ways to know it. The next morning, he returned to Bankei with empty hands. "I couldn't make the list." "Why not?" "Because I kept finding that I could know things, or learn things, or figure things out. I couldn't find anything I genuinely don't know." Bankei smiled. "Then you've learned nothing from your books. Because the wisest people are the ones who understand the vastness of what they don't know. Knowledge is a small island in an ocean of mystery. The more you know, the more coastline you have touching that ocean, the more you realize how much is unknown. But you've built your island and convinced yourself it's the whole world." He gestured for Tetsu to sit. "Tell me something simple. Why does the sun rise each morning?" "Because of the Earth's rotation," Tetsu answered confidently. "And why does the Earth rotate?" "Because of physics, angular momentum from the solar system's formation." "And why does the universe have these laws of physics rather than different ones?" Tetsu opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no answer. "You see?" Bankei said gently. 3 questions deep, and we've reached mystery. You can describe what happens, but you can't explain why it happens, why existence is this way rather than some other way. Behind every answer is a deeper question, and eventually we reach the ground of not knowing. He poured tea for both of them. The problem with collecting knowledge is that it makes you think you understand. You learn the names of things, the explanations, the theories, and you mistake the map for the territory. You think because you can explain how a flower grows, you understand the flower, but you don't. The mystery of existence, of consciousness, of why there's something rather than nothing, this remains completely unknown no matter how much you learn. Tetsu felt something loosening in his chest. So all my study was worthless? Not worthless, Bankei replied, but incomplete. Knowledge without the humility of not knowing is just cleverness. It makes you think you've arrived when you've barely begun the journey. The real beginning of wisdom is when you stop pretending to know and start genuinely inquiring into what you don't know and can't know. Over the following months, Tetsu's approach to learning changed completely. Instead of trying to know everything, he practiced living with mystery. Instead of collecting answers, he sat with questions. Instead of explaining away wonder, he let himself be filled with it. He discovered that not knowing wasn't weakness or ignorance. It was openness. It was the beginner's mind that could see things freshly. It was the humility that made real learning possible. Years later, when Tetsu had students of his own, they would sometimes come to him full of questions, wanting answers to everything. And Tetsu would smile and ask, "What do you really want to know?" "Everything," they would say. And Tetsu would reply, "Then start by knowing that you know nothing. That the mystery is vast and you're a brief candle trying to illuminate infinity. Let that not knowing be your teacher. It's more honest than any answer I could give you. Tonight, let yourself not know. You don't have to figure everything out. You don't have to understand your life completely. You don't have to know why things happen or what it all means. You can rest in mystery, in not knowing, in the simple presence of being alive, without needing to explain it. The wisest rest comes not from having all the answers, but from being comfortable with questions that have no answers. Let yourself not know. That's where wisdom begins. As the lantern of awareness glows a little brighter, we come to a tale about seeing with more than the eyes. Let the stillness guide you now, and listen carefully to the next story.